Carl Jung explained. 11 signs. You're finally releasing control and letting life begin. In the beginning, there is the fortress. You know it well, this citadel you have built brick by careful brick, stone upon stone, each wall erected with the precision of someone who has learned that survival depends upon control. Here, within these ramparts of certainty, your ego stands sentinel, that vigilant guardian of consciousness, who never sleeps, never rests, never allows a single crack to appear in the carefully mortared facade of who you believe yourself to be. Listen closely to the sound of your own footsteps, echoing through these corridors of selfhood. Each step rings with the authority of someone who has mapped every corner of their existence, cataloged every response, rehearsed every possible encounter with the world beyond these walls. This is the kingdom of the known, the realm where you reign supreme because you have made yourself both architect and prisoner of its limitations. The ego, that masterful storyteller, whispers its familiar narratives in your ear. You are safe here. You are in control here. Here, within these boundaries, you know exactly who you are and what the world expects of you. And for a time, perhaps many years, perhaps decades, these stories feel like truth itself, solid as the stone beneath your feet. But observe the nature of this fortress more closely. See how its walls cast shadows not only upon the world outside, but upon the vast territories within your own being. The ego, in its zealous guardianship, has cordoned off entire provinces of your soul, declaring them too dangerous, too unpredictable, too wild to be explored. It has drawn maps of your psyche with clear boundaries. Here lies the acceptable self. There lurks the shadow that must never see daylight. This is the sacred paradox that Jung understood so deeply, that the very mechanism designed to protect us from psychological dissolution becomes, in its extremity, the source of our greatest suffering. For the ego, left to its own devices, does not merely guard the castle. It begins to mistake itself for the entire kingdom. You have felt this, haven't you? That peculiar exhaustion that comes not from living fully, but from the constant effort of maintaining the walls. The way each day requires you to don the familiar armor of your persona, to perform the well-rehearsed dance of who you are supposed to be. The morning mirror reflects back not the wild mystery of a soul in process, but the practiced expression of someone who has learned to exist within acceptable parameters. And yet, beneath the floorboards of consciousness, something stirs. The unconscious, that vast ocean of possibility that your fortress was built to hold at bay, continues its patient work. Like water finding its way through stone, the unlived aspects of your being begin to seep through the smallest cracks in your certainty. Dreams arrive unbidden, carrying symbols your rational mind cannot decode. Moods descend without warning, emotions that don't fit the carefully constructed narrative of your controlled existence. The ego responds to these intrusions with increasing vigilance. New rules are established, stricter protocols implemented. The fortress grows higher, its walls thicker, its gates more heavily guarded. But here is what the ego, for all its intelligence, cannot comprehend. That which we resist with the greatest force is often that which carries our deepest medicine. Jung called this process individuation, the soul's inexorable movement toward wholeness. And individuation, by its very nature, demands the dissolution of the ego's tyrannical grip upon consciousness. Not the destruction of the ego itself, but the transformation of its role from dictator to servant, from fortress commander to humble navigator of the mysterious journey inward. This transformation cannot be willed into being. It cannot be controlled, planned, or strategized into existence. It requires something far more terrifying to the ego than action. It requires surrender. It requires the gradual, often agonizing recognition that the very thing we have been most proud of, our ability to manage, to control, to maintain the careful architecture of our constructed selves, may be the very thing standing between us and the life we came here to live. Consider the nature of the river that flows just beyond your fortress walls. You have glimpsed it, perhaps, in moments when your guard was down, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the silence that follows great laughter, in the stillness that descends after tears. This river carries within its currents not chaos as the ego fears, but a different kind of order, the organic intelligence of life itself, moving always toward greater complexity, deeper truth, more authentic expression. The ego observes this river with suspicion. It sees only danger in its flowing nature, only uncertainty in its refusal to be mapped and controlled. But the soul, that deeper aspect of being that dwells in the castle's forgotten chambers, recognizes the river as home. The soul remembers what the ego has forgotten, that we were never meant to live in isolation from the flowing mysteries of existence, but to dance with them, to be changed by them, to allow ourselves to be carved by their patient currents into forms we could never have imagined from within our fortress walls. This is why the spiritual traditions speak of dying before you die, of losing yourself to find yourself. They understand what depth psychology has rediscovered. That authentic transformation requires a kind of sacred death. The death of the ego's illusion that it is the totality of who we are. It is a death that makes space for a different kind of life to emerge, a life that flows not from the narrow confines of what we think we know about ourselves, but from the vast intelligence of the self, that archetypal center of wholeness that Jung recognized as our truest nature. But the ego does not give up its throne easily. It was built for survival, after all, forged in the fires of early experience, when maintaining control over our environment meant the difference between safety and annihilation. The child within us learned that being good enough, smart enough, attractive enough, successful enough, could earn us love, could guarantee our place in the world. And so the ego set about creating a self that could meet these demands, could perform these requirements with increasing sophistication. The tragedy is not that we built these defenses. They were necessary, even heroic responses to the vulnerable condition of being human. The tragedy lies in forgetting that they were meant to be temporary structures, scaffolding to support us while we learn to stand in our own authentic presence. Instead, we have lived inside the scaffolding so long that we have forgotten the building it was meant to support. This is what the mystics mean when they speak of the false self, what Buddhism calls the ego illusion, what Jung understood as the dangerous identification of consciousness with the ego alone. We have mistaken the guard for the king, the servant for the master, the persona for the person. And from this fundamental confusion flows all the suffering that marks the unlived life, the anxiety of maintaining an impossible perfection, the exhaustion of performing a role that grows more ill-fitting with each passing year, the depression that settles upon the soul when it realizes how far it has wandered from its own truth. Yet even this suffering carries its own intelligence. For it is precisely when the fortress becomes most prison-like that the first cracks begin to appear in its foundations. It is when the ego's strategies stop working that we are finally forced to question their validity. It is when control reveals itself as the elaborate illusion it has always been that we begin to glimpse the possibility of a different way of being. This glimpsing is not comfortable. The ego experiences it as a threat to its very existence, and in a sense it is right to be afraid, for what lies ahead is indeed a kind of death, the death of the old way of organizing consciousness, around the narrow demands of security and control. But it is also a birth, the emergence of a way of being that the ego, in its isolation, could never have imagined. Jung understood this process with the depth of someone who had undergone it himself. He knew that the journey toward individuation is simultaneously a journey toward the dissolution of our most cherished illusions about who we are. It is a path that leads us not to greater certainty, but to a more profound relationship with uncertainty, not to the elimination of suffering, but to a transformed understanding of what our suffering has been trying to teach us. The fortress of the ego serves its purpose for a time. It teaches us the necessary skills of functioning in the world, of maintaining boundaries, of developing the capacity for focused attention and directed action. But there comes a moment in the soul's development when the fortress becomes too small to contain the growing fullness of who we are becoming. The walls that once protected us now constrain us. The moat that once kept danger at bay now keeps out the very experiences that could nourish our continued growth. This moment of recognition is both terrifying and sacred. It marks the beginning of what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the conscious participation in our own transformation. For the ego, it feels like everything solid is becoming liquid. Everything certain is dissolving into question marks. But for the soul, it is the first glimpse of home, the recognition that we were never meant to live in exile from our own depths, never intended to exist as refugees from the very mystery that gave us birth. The river beyond your walls calls to something older than your fear, deeper than your need for control. It speaks in the language of dreams and symbols, in the poetry of synchronicity, in the silent knowing that sometimes rises from the depths of being when we have finally exhausted ourselves with trying to be who we think we should be. Can you hear it? Even now, even as your ego constructs its arguments for maintaining the status quo, for keeping the walls intact, for protecting yourself from the chaos, you imagine waits in the unknown territories of your own being. The river's song is patient. It has been flowing since before your fortress was conceived, and it will continue flowing long after these walls have crumbled into the earth that gave them form. This is where our journey begins, not with the false confidence of someone who has all the answers, but with the trembling courage of someone who is finally ready to question everything they thought they knew about themselves. It begins with the first tentative recognition that the fortress of the ego, for all its impressive architecture, may not be the final destination of consciousness, but merely its training ground. The path ahead leads through territories that cannot be mapped from within the familiar confines of controlled existence. It requires a different kind of navigation, one that trusts not in the ego's careful calculations, but in the deeper intelligence of the psyche itself. That mysterious faculty that knows how to grow an oak tree from an acorn, how to heal a wound without conscious intervention, how to dream dreams that carry more wisdom than our waking minds can comprehend. To undertake this journey is to join the ranks of those who have discovered that the greatest adventure is not the conquest of external worlds, but the exploration of the infinite depths within. It is to step into the river of becoming and allow ourselves to be carried toward a destination that the fortress-building mind could never have conceived, but which the soul has been homesick for all along. Something shifts in the ancient marble of your being, not a breaking, not yet, but the whisper of stress that precedes all great transformations, like the first breath of spring finding its way through winter's seemingly impenetrable armor. There comes a moment when the flawless facade begins to show the hairline fractures that will eventually reshape the entire architecture of who you believe yourself to be. You have spent years, perhaps decades, perfecting this masterpiece of self-presentation, the persona that carefully crafted mask Jung recognized as both necessary protection and potential prison, has been polished to such brilliance that even you have forgotten where the performance ends and the authentic self begins. You have become a master craftsman of your own image, sculpting yourself into the precise shape that the world seems to demand, smoothing away every rough edge, every unexpected angle, every trace of the wild uncertainty that marks genuine human existence. But perfection, that false god of the ego's devotion, is not sustainable. It cannot be, for it runs counter to the fundamental nature of life itself. That creative force which expresses itself not through static completion, but through endless becoming, through the dynamic dance between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown, between what is and what is eternally possible. The first crack appears subtly. Perhaps it manifests as a strange exhaustion that settles over you at moments of supposed triumph. You achieve what you have worked toward, receive the recognition you have sought, yet instead of the satisfaction you expected, there is only a hollow echo where fulfillment should resonate. The applause sounds distant, muffled, as if reaching you through thick glass that separates you from the life you are supposed to be living. Or perhaps the fracture reveals itself as a growing sense of alienation from your own achievements. The goals that once pulled you forward with magnetic force now feel curiously weightless, their pursuit mechanical rather than inspired. You find yourself going through the motions of success, while some deeper part of you withdraws, growing increasingly resistant to the relentless demands of maintaining your polished image. This is the paradox that the ego cannot resolve through its usual strategies of analysis and control. For the very mechanisms that created your success, the discipline, the focus, the unwavering commitment to excellence, have also created a kind of spiritual exhaustion. You have become so skilled at being who you think you should be that you have lost touch with who you actually are beneath the layers of accumulated performance. The persona, which began as a necessary adaptation to social reality, has grown into a kind of exoskeleton, protective certainly, but also increasingly constrictive. What once allowed you to navigate the world with confidence now feels like armor that you cannot remove. Even in the most intimate moments of your existence, you have become trapped inside your own competence, imprisoned by your own success at being the person others expect you to be. Jung understood this particular form of suffering with the compassion of someone who had experienced it firsthand. He recognized that the persona, when it hardens into identity, rather than remaining a flexible tool, creates a split in consciousness that inevitably leads to crisis. The authentic self, what he called the self with a capital S, that archetypal center of wholeness, cannot be indefinitely suppressed beneath layers of social adaptation without eventually asserting its presence through symptoms, through dreams, through the mysterious language of psychological disturbance. This is why the spiritual traditions speak of the dark night of the soul not as pathology, but as initiation. They understand that certain kinds of suffering are not obstacles to growth, but doorways through which consciousness must pass to reach deeper levels of authenticity. The breaking of the persona is one such doorway, painful, disorienting, but ultimately sacred in its capacity to return us to relationship with the parts of ourselves we had forgotten in our zealous pursuit of perfection. Feel into this moment of cracking, this threshold experience where the familiar structures of identity begin to show their impermanence. There is terror here, yes, but also strange relief. For how long have you carried the burden of being flawless? How many years have you devoted to the impossible task of presenting yourself as someone who has transcended the messy realities of human existence, the doubts, the fears, the contradictions that mark every authentic life? The crack in your marble perfection reveals not weakness, but humanity. It shows you something that the ego, in its grandiose isolation, had forgotten, that you are not a statue to be admired from a distance, but a living being in process, a consciousness in the midst of its own becoming. The flaws that the persona worked so desperately to hide are not evidence of failure but signs of life itself, the beautiful imperfection that distinguishes the authentic from the artificial, the organic from the mechanical, the real from the performed. This recognition brings with it a different kind of seeing, where once you looked at others through the lens of judgment, measuring their performance against your own standards of excellence, now you begin to glimpse the shared vulnerability that marks our common condition. The people you once dismissed as less successful, less accomplished, less worthy of attention, suddenly reveal themselves as fellow travelers, struggling with their own versions of the same fundamental human challenges that you, in your perfection, had imagined yourself beyond. There is a strange intimacy in this recognition, a dissolution of the barriers that the persona had erected between you and the rest of humanity. For the first time in years, perhaps, you feel not like an actor performing on a stage, but like a participant in the great mystery of existence, uncertain, vulnerable, but also vibrantly alive in ways that your polished presentation had made impossible. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the necessity of embracing our shadow, not the evil or destructive aspects of our nature, but all the human qualities that our persona had declared inadmissible. The sadness we were not supposed to feel, the anger we were trained to suppress, the confusion we were taught to hide, the longing we learned to disguise as ambition. All of this returns now, not as pathology, but as lost fragments of our complete humanity seeking reintegration. The shadow that emerges from behind the cracking facade is not the monster the ego feared it would be. It is instead the repository of unlived life, all the experiences, emotions, and expressions that were sacrificed in service of maintaining the perfect image. It carries within it not just the pain of what was rejected, but the vitality that was constrained, the creativity that was channeled into narrow acceptable forms, the spontaneity that was choreographed into predictable performances. This is why Jung insisted that shadow work is not about becoming a worse person, but about becoming a whole person. The integration of shadow material does not diminish us, it completes us. It returns to consciousness the energy that was bound up in maintaining the split between who we are and who we think we should be. It reunites us with the parts of ourselves that contain not just our wounds, but our gifts, the unpolished talents that were deemed unmarketable, the unconventional insights that didn't fit the approved narrative, the wild dreams that were too impractical to pursue. But this integration cannot happen while the persona remains rigidly in control, while the ego continues to insist that perfection is both possible and necessary. The cracking must continue. The ancient marble must give way, not to chaos, but to the organic flexibility that allows for genuine growth. What feels like falling apart is actually falling together, the return of scattered fragments to their natural wholeness. You may find, in these moments of dissolution, that your carefully planned life begins to show signs of spontaneity that both terrify and exhilarate you. Decisions emerge from deeper sources than rational calculation. Conversations veer into unexpected territories of honesty. Relationships begin to reorganize themselves around authenticity rather than mutual performance. The script you have been following so faithfully reveals itself to have been written by someone else, a collective voice of social expectation that never knew the particular story your soul came here to live. This realization can trigger what the mystics called the great doubt, a profound questioning not just of your choices, but of the entire framework within which those choices were made. If the person you have worked so hard to become is not who you actually are, then who are you beneath all the accumulated layers of adaptation and performance? If the goals you have pursued with such dedication were not truly your own, then what does your authentic path look like? If the relationships built around your persona are not based on genuine connection, then what would real intimacy feel like? These questions cannot be answered from within the old paradigm of control and certainty. They require a different kind of intelligence, the patient wisdom of the unconscious, which speaks not in logical arguments but in dreams, in synchronicities, in the subtle promptings of intuition that the rational mind learned long ago to dismiss as unreliable. This is the intelligence that knows how to dissolve the unnecessary without destroying the essential, how to break down rigid structures while preserving what is truly valuable within them. The persona does not need to be destroyed, only transformed. Its function as a social interface remains important. We need some capacity to engage appropriately with different contexts and relationships, but it must be returned to its proper role as servant rather than master, as a flexible tool rather than a fixed identity. This transformation requires the development of what Jung called a new attitude, a way of relating to ourselves that includes both the polished presentation and the raw humanity, both the competent adapter and the uncertain explorer, both the successful achiever and the wounded seeker. Such integration is not a comfortable process. The ego, faced with the dissolution of its carefully constructed world, often responds with increasing desperation. Old strategies are employed with new intensity. The perfectionist drive may become even more compulsive as it senses its authority threatened. The need for control may manifest in increasingly rigid ways as the underlying chaos becomes more apparent. This is enantiodromia beginning its work, the psyche's tendency to swing toward the opposite when any attitude becomes too extreme. But you cannot go back to the unconscious innocence of believing in your own perfection. The crack has been made, the marble has been marked, the process of dissolution has begun. What lies ahead is not the restoration of the old order, but the emergence of something entirely new, a way of being that encompasses both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability, both knowing and not knowing. This is not the perfection of the persona, which excludes so much of human experience, but the completion of individuation, which includes everything that belongs to your particular expression of consciousness. The chrysalis of control that has encased your authentic development is beginning its sacred work of dissolution. What emerges will not be a more perfect version of who you used to be, but someone you could never have, imagined from within the constraints of your former identity. Someone who carries both the wisdom gained through suffering and the innocence recovered through surrender, both the skills developed through discipline and the spontaneity freed through acceptance of imperfection. This emergence cannot be rushed or controlled. Like all genuine transformation, it follows its own mysterious timetable, responsive not to the ego's demands for quick resolution, but to the deeper rhythms of psychological development. The crack in your marble perfection is not a problem to be solved, but a gateway to be entered with reverence for the mystery of your own becoming. There comes a moment in the soul's evolution when the very thing that once terrified us most begins to exert a strange magnetism. Where once you fled from uncertainty like a moth from flame, now you find yourself drawn to its flickering edges, curious about what might be revealed in the shadows cast by your own rigid certainties. This is the mysterious work of enantiodromia, that fundamental principle Jung discovered in the depths of the psyche, where every extreme eventually calls forth its opposite, where every one-sided attitude eventually summons the compensatory force that will restore balance to consciousness. You have lived for so long in the realm of the known, haven't you? Every morning choreographed, every response rehearsed, every possible outcome anticipated and prepared for. Your life has become a dance performed to music you memorized so long ago that you have forgotten it was ever improvised. The steps are perfect now, flawless in their execution, but somewhere in the precision, the soul of the dance has been lost. But watch what happens when the music changes, not through any conscious choice of your own. The ego would never willingly abandon its carefully constructed choreography, but through the mysterious intelligence of the psyche itself, which knows that consciousness cannot grow without being challenged, cannot deepen without being disturbed, cannot individuate without learning to dance with the unknown. The first invitations arrive subtly. Perhaps it is a conversation that veers unexpectedly into territories you had not mapped, and instead of steering it back to familiar ground, you find yourself following its meandering path with something approaching delight. Or maybe it is a decision that needs to be made, and for the first time in years, you discover yourself pausing not to calculate the optimal outcome, but to listen for what wants to emerge from the silence between thoughts. These are small rebellions against the tyranny of certainty, tiny revolutions mounted by the part of you that has grown weary of living inside the same story, no matter how successfully it has been performed. They signal the beginning of what the mystics called the second half of life, not necessarily measured in chronological years, but in the soul's readiness to move beyond the tasks of establishment and security toward the deeper work of meaning and authenticity. This transition is rarely comfortable. The ego, which has invested so much energy in creating a predictable existence, experiences these stirrings toward uncertainty as a threat to everything it has worked to achieve. It marshals its considerable resources in defense of the status quo, constructing elaborate arguments for why change is unnecessary, why risk is foolish, why the known difficulties are preferable to unknown possibilities. But the call toward uncertainty is not coming from the ego's domain. It arises from deeper sources, from the self, that archetypal center of wholeness that Jung recognized as the true organizing principle of the psyche. The self is not interested in the ego's projects of security and control. It is oriented toward completeness, toward the full expression of your particular consciousness, toward the unique story that only you can tell with your life. This is why uncertainty begins to feel less like a threat and more like an invitation. The self recognizes what the ego cannot see, that the unknown is not empty space to be feared, but pregnant darkness full of possibilities that the controlling mind could never conceive. It is the primordial womb from which all new life emerges, the fertile void that precedes every genuine creation, the sacred space where transformation becomes possible. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's innate capacity to bridge the gap between conscious and unconscious, between what we know about ourselves and what we have yet to discover. This function cannot operate in an environment of rigid certainty, for it requires the tension between opposites, the creative friction that arises when the known meets the unknown, and something entirely new is born from their encounter. You begin to notice this creative tension manifesting in unexpected ways. Conversations become more spontaneous, less scripted. Decisions emerge from deeper consultation with your own experience rather than from external authorities or predetermined formulas. There is a growing trust in your capacity to navigate without a map, to respond authentically to whatever arises rather than forcing reality to conform to your preconceptions. This is the dance with uncertainty that characterizes the individuation process, not a reckless abandonment of all structure and planning, but a more fluid relationship with control, a willingness to hold your plans lightly and remain open to course corrections from sources beyond the rational mind. It is learning to trust what the Taoists called wu wei, action that arises from non-action, decisions that emerge from stillness, responses that flow from deep listening rather than calculated strategy. The ego finds this deeply unsettling. It was trained to believe that certainty equals safety, that control equals security, that having all the answers equals competence. To willingly enter into relationship with uncertainty feels like a betrayal of everything it learned to value. Yet here you are, drawn by invisible threads toward the very experiences that challenge these fundamental assumptions about what it means to live well. Perhaps you find yourself saying yes to invitations you would have automatically declined, not because you have logically determined they are good for you, but because something deeper than logic recognizes them as doorways. Maybe you catch yourself pausing before giving the familiar answers to familiar questions, creating space for responses you had not planned to give. The rigid choreography of your existence begins to show signs of improvisation, moments of genuine spontaneity that surprise even you. This is how the psyche heals its own one-sidedness, where consciousness has become too fixed in patterns of control and certainty. The unconscious begins to constellate experiences that invite greater flexibility, more openness, a willingness to be changed by encounter rather than always insisting that the encounter conform to our expectations. It is not punishment, but medicine, the specific remedy that your particular consciousness needs for its continued growth. The dance with uncertainty is also a dance with trust, not blind faith in positive outcomes, but a deeper confidence in your capacity to meet whatever arises with presence and authenticity. This trust cannot be manufactured through willpower or positive thinking. It emerges naturally as you discover again and again that uncertainty is not the catastrophe the ego imagined it would be, but a doorway into deeper relationship with the creative intelligence that animates all existence. You begin to notice that your most meaningful experiences have always emerged from uncertainty. The conversations that mattered most were those that went off script. The relationships that changed you were those you could never have planned. The insights that transformed your understanding arose not from methodical analysis, but from the mysterious alchemy of not knowing meeting, genuine inquiry. The rigid adherence to certainty had not protected you from difficulty. It had protected you from life itself. This recognition brings with it a fundamental shift in your relationship with planning and control. These capacities do not disappear. They remain valuable tools for navigating practical reality, but they are no longer the sole organizing principles of your existence. They become servants of a larger intelligence, the deep knowing that understands timing and rhythm, and the organic unfolding of your unique path toward wholeness. The dance with uncertainty becomes a practice, a way of being that you cultivate not because it is always comfortable, but because it keeps you alive to the present moment, responsive to the subtle currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. It is a practice of staying curious rather than conclusive, of remaining teachable rather than insisting that you already know what needs to be known. This does not mean living chaotically or abandoning all discrimination. Uncertainty is not chaos. It is the creative space from which order emerges organically rather than being imposed artificially. It is learning to dance with the rhythm of life itself, which includes both expansion and contraction, both movement and stillness, both knowing and not knowing in an ever-changing dynamic balance. Jung understood that this dance is not optional for those who would individuate. It is the very mechanism by which consciousness grows beyond its current limitations. Every time we willingly enter the space of not knowing, we create an opening for new understanding to emerge. Every time we release our grip on how things should be, we make space for discovering how things actually are. Every time we choose curiosity over certainty, we align ourselves with the creative force that seeks expression through our particular life. The person you are becoming through this dance could never have been planned by the person you used to be. The controlling mind cannot imagine the gifts that await on the far side of its own dissolution. The ego cannot conceive of the freedom that comes when it learns to serve rather than dominate consciousness. This is why the path of individuation requires faith, not belief in specific outcomes, but trust in the process of transformation itself. Watch how this dance begins to permeate all aspects of your existence. Relationships deepen as you become more willing to be known in your uncertainty rather than hiding behind the mask of having everything figured out. Creative projects emerge from sources you had not previously recognized, surprising you with their organic intelligence. Decisions feel less forced, less effortful, as if they are arising from consultation with a wisdom that includes but transcends your individual understanding. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of aligning with the Tao, with the will of God, with the natural order of things. They were not advocating passivity, but pointing toward a way of being that trusts the deeper intelligence of existence to guide the dance, while remaining fully present and responsive to whatever steps the dance requires in each moment. The rigid choreography of your former existence gives way to something more like jazz, structured enough to create coherence, but improvisational enough to allow for genuine creativity. You begin to trust not just in your ability to execute predetermined plans, but in your capacity to respond creatively to whatever the moment brings, to find your way not by following a map, but by developing the internal compass that can navigate by the subtle magnetism of meaning itself. This is the sacred dance with uncertainty that transforms the controlling ego into something more flexible and responsive, not destroyed, but alchemically transformed into a partner in the great work of individuation rather than its primary obstacle. Like winter ice yielding to spring's patient warmth, something fundamental begins to shift in the landscape of your inner world. The harsh tribunals that once dominated your psychological terrain, those merciless courts of judgment that carved reality into rigid categories of right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, worthy and unworthy, begin their slow, sacred dissolution. This is not collapse, but thaw, not destruction, but the gradual softening that allows what was frozen to flow again, what was separate to merge, what was brittle to become flexible enough to bend without breaking. You have lived for so long in the black and white world of absolutes, haven't you? It seemed safer there, more manageable, where every person could be quickly categorized, every situation rapidly assessed, every choice clearly labeled as either wise or foolish. The inner critic that Jung recognized as the internalized voice of collective judgment had established itself as supreme arbiter of your experience, wielding its gavel with the authority of someone who believed that harsh evaluation was the same thing as wisdom. But watch what happens as the spring of consciousness begins its work. Notice how the sharp edges of your judgments start to blur at the boundaries, how the clear-cut distinctions that once seemed so obvious begin to reveal their arbitrariness. The people you had dismissed as failures show you corners of wisdom you had missed. The choices you had condemned as obviously wrong reveal their hidden intelligence. The aspects of yourself you had exiled to the shadow begin to show their faces not as enemies to be defeated, but as lost children seeking return to the family of your wholeness. This softening is not weakness, though the ego, trained in the brutal mathematics of comparison and competition, may interpret it as such. It is instead the emergence of what Jung called the wisdom of the self, that deeper organizing intelligence which sees, with eyes unclouded by the ego's desperate need to maintain its sense of superiority through the diminishment of others. The self does not judge because it does not need to judge. It sees the whole pattern, the complete picture, the entire ecosystem of consciousness in which every element plays its necessary role. The transformation begins subtly. Perhaps you catch yourself in the middle of a familiar judgment and pause, not to suppress the judgment, but to become curious about its origins. Where did this particular standard of evaluation come from? Whose voice do you hear echoing in your internal courthouse? What fear or wound drives the need to categorize this experience as fundamentally wrong or right, rather than simply what it is, a facet of the infinite complexity that characterizes existence itself? This curiosity is itself a form of compassion, though you may not recognize it as such initially. It represents a willingness to investigate rather than condemn, to understand rather than merely evaluate, to hold space for complexity rather than rushing to judgment. It signals the beginning of what the contemplative traditions call the heart of understanding, that quality of awareness that can witness the full spectrum of human experience without immediately rushing to sort it into neat categories of approval or disapproval. As this process deepens, you begin to notice how exhausting the constant work of judgment had become. The mental energy required to maintain your elaborate system of evaluations, to defend your opinions against contrary evidence, to uphold your standards in the face of life's persistent refusal to conform to them. All of this had been draining your psychic resources, leaving little energy available for the more creative work of actually engaging with reality as it is rather than as you think it should be. The softening of judgments reveals itself not as moral relativism or the abandonment of discernment, but as the development of what Jung called a discriminating consciousness, a way of seeing that can distinguish between what is helpful and what is harmful, without needing to condemn what is harmful as inherently evil, or elevate what is helpful to the status of absolute good. This consciousness recognizes that most human experience exists in the vast middle territory between extremes, in the subtle gradations of gray that the black and white mind had learned to overlook in its rush to certainty. You find yourself becoming more interested in understanding than in being right. Conversations shift from debates to be won, to mysteries to be explored. The people in your life are no longer characters in your story, to be judged for how well they play their roles, but fellow travelers whose journeys intersect with yours in ways that may be meaningful precisely because they are different from your own path. This shift brings with it a profound relief that you may not have expected. For how long had you carried the burden of being the judge of your own experience and that of others? How much energy had been devoted to maintaining the elaborate courthouse of consciousness, where every thought, feeling, and action had to be weighed against standards that were often inherited rather than consciously chosen, often more about conformity than wisdom, often more about fear than love? The inner critic does not disappear overnight. It has been too useful, too central to the ego's strategies of control and self-protection to simply vanish without trace. But its role begins to change. Where once it ruled with tyrannical authority, now it becomes one voice among many, its harsh pronouncements balanced by other perspectives. The voice of compassion that can see the wound behind the behavior, the voice of wisdom that can recognize the learning embedded in apparent mistakes, the voice of love that can hold even your own failures with tenderness rather than condemnation. This transformation affects every aspect of your existence. Relationships that had been strained by your need to be right begin to breathe with new life as you become more interested in connection than correction. creative projects that had been stifled by perfectionism find space to emerge in their natural, imperfect beauty. Self-care becomes possible as you release yourself from the impossible standard of never making mistakes, never having difficult emotions, never needing help or support from others. Jung understood that this softening was not just personally healing but collectively necessary. The harsh judgments we carry about ourselves inevitably spill over into our evaluations of others. The standards we use to condemn our own humanity become the weapons we wield against the humanity of those around us. The softening of inner judgment creates space, not just for personal growth, but for the kind of authentic relationship that can bridge the artificial divisions that fragment human community. You begin to see how your judgments had created a kind of exile, not just for others who failed to meet your standards, but for parts of yourself that had been banished to the psychological underground. The shadow material that Jung recognized as containing not just our rejected negative qualities, but our unlived positive ones as well, begins to emerge from hiding as the harsh climate of internal judgment gives way to something more hospitable to the full spectrum of human experience. This does not mean embracing everything indiscriminately or abandoning all capacity for discernment. The wisdom that emerges from softened judgment is actually more precise than the crude categorizations of the harsh critic, more capable of subtle distinction, more able to respond appropriately to the unique circumstances that characterize each moment rather than applying rigid rules that were formulated in different contexts for different purposes. You discover that compassion is not the absence of discernment, but discernment infused with understanding. It can see clearly what is and what is not helpful, without needing to attach moral weight to every observation. It can recognize harmful patterns without condemning the person caught in them. It can acknowledge mistakes without turning them into evidence of fundamental unworthiness. This compassionate discernment extends not just to others, but to yourself. The mistakes you have made, the opportunities you have missed, the ways you have fallen short of your own ideals. All of this begins to be held within a larger context of understanding that recognizes these apparent failures as part of the necessary curriculum of consciousness, the specific experiences your soul needed to encounter in order to develop the particular qualities that characterize your unique expression of humanity. The seasons of your own psychological development reveal their intelligence when viewed from this softer perspective. The periods you had judged as wasted time show their hidden productivity. The relationships you had condemned as mistakes reveal the essential lessons they carried. The choices that had seemed obviously wrong at the time demonstrate their role in bringing you to exactly where you needed to be for the next phase of your development to unfold. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of seeing with the eyes of God, with Buddha nature, with unconditional love. They were pointing toward this quality of awareness that can witness the entire human drama without needing to sort it into the categories that the threatened ego uses to maintain its illusion of control and superiority. It sees the whole dance, recognizes the intelligence embedded in apparent chaos, trusts the process of unfoldment, even when its specific steps seem counterproductive or destructive from a limited perspective. The softening of judgments creates space for what Jung called the religious function, not adherence to particular doctrines or beliefs, but the natural capacity of consciousness to recognize its connection to something larger than the individual ego, something that includes and transcends personal will and understanding. This recognition brings with it a quality of reverence that makes harsh judgment feel not just unnecessary, but almost sacrilegious, a violation of the sacred mystery that expresses itself through the infinite diversity of human experience. As this softening continues, you may find that your very presence becomes healing for others. People sense when they are in the company of someone who is not secretly judging them, not waiting for them to make a mistake that can be held against them, not keeping score of their failures and successes. In the space of non-judgment, they can relax into more authentic expression, can risk being vulnerable, can show aspects of themselves that the harsh light of criticism would have kept hidden. This creates what Jung recognized as the holding environment necessary for psychological growth, not just for others, but for the continued development of your own consciousness. The parts of yourself that had been hiding from the inner critic can finally emerge into the light. Creative impulses that had been suppressed by the fear of imperfection can begin their natural expression. Spontaneous responses that had been filtered through elaborate systems of judgment can flow more directly from the authentic sources of your being. The winter of harsh judgment gives way to the spring of merciful awareness. Ice becomes flowing water. Rigid categories soften into organic gradations. The courthouse of consciousness transforms into something more like a garden, still requiring care and attention, but oriented toward growth rather than condemnation, toward nurturing what wants to emerge rather than eliminating what seems problematic. This is the alchemy of compassion, not a sentimental attitude that overlooks genuine problems, but a fundamental transformation in the quality of awareness itself. It sees more clearly because it sees without the distorting lens of judgment. It responds more appropriately because it is not constrained by the need to maintain predetermined positions. It loves more fully because it has ceased the exhausting work of trying to improve reality through constant criticism of its failure to conform to ego-generated ideals. In this softened landscape, you finally begin to see others not as characters in your personal story, but as fellow travelers on the winding path of individuation, each carrying their own wounds and gifts, each learning their own essential lessons, each contributing their unique note to the vast symphony of consciousness, exploring itself through the instrument of human experience. The judgment dissolves, and in its place flows the recognition that we are all walking each other home. There comes a moment in the great turning of consciousness when the cards of our carefully constructed identity scatter like autumn leaves in an unexpected wind, and there, tumbling from the cosmic deck with wild abandon, appears the fool, not as harbinger of doom, but as messenger of liberation. Watch how your soul quickens at the sight, recognizing something ancient and true in that figure, poised at the cliff's edge, one foot already dancing over the abyss. For so long we have armored ourselves in the gleaming mail of expertise, each achievement a metal plate hammered into place, each accolade a rivet securing us more firmly within the fortress of knowing. We have built ourselves into monuments of competence, marble statues of certainty, believing that to be worthy of love, respect, and belonging, we must never reveal the trembling uncertainty that lives at our core. But the fool whispers a different truth, that our stumbling steps might be more sacred than our sure-footed march, that our questions might hold more wisdom than our answers. See how the child self stirs behind the adult's careful facades, like a prisoner suddenly hearing the sound of keys. She has been waiting there all along, that bright-eyed one who knew how to finger paint without considering critics, who asked questions that made philosophers weep with their simplicity, who fell down and got up again without the weight of shame or the burden of maintaining reputation. The fool's journey begins with her recognition, not as someone to be protected or hidden, but as the very essence of what makes us magnificently, vulnerably human. The beginner's mind is not ignorance wearing a disguise, it is wisdom wearing its true face. When we approach life with the fool's curious delight, we discover that every moment offers itself as teacher. every interaction as mystery school, every mistake as sacrament. The expert's curse is that she already knows what she will find before she begins looking. The fool's blessing is that he expects to be surprised, and in that expectation creates the very conditions for wonder to flourish. Consider how different your days become when you trade the exhausting performance of having it all figured out for the exhilarating adventure of figuring it out as you go. The mask of the all-knowing adult, worn so long it has left permanent indentations on your authentic face, begins to soften and slip. Beneath it, you discover features you had forgotten, the wide eyes of genuine curiosity, the quick smile of someone delighted to be wrong, if being wrong leads to something more interesting than being right. In the archetypal realm where symbols speak louder than words, the fool carries a small bundle on a stick, not the heavy luggage of a lifetime's accumulation, but the light pack of someone who travels by faith rather than preparation. What would you pack in such a bundle? Not your degrees or your achievements, not your 5-year plans or your carefully cultivated image. Perhaps only the willingness to begin again, the courage to not know, the faith that the path appears under the feet of those willing to walk it. The wisdom traditions speak of beginner's mind as shoshin, the attitude of openness, eagerness, and lack of preconceptions when studying a subject, even when studying at an advanced level. But the fool takes us deeper than intellectual humility. He invites us into the lived experience of perpetual beginning, where every dawn is the first dawn, every breath the first breath, every step into relationship or creativity or spiritual practice, a leap into virgin territory. Watch how the psyche reorganizes itself around this new orientation. The rigid structures of the expert mind, with its categories and hierarchies, its need to classify and control, begin to soften like wax in the warmth of wonder. In their place grows something more organic, more responsive, a consciousness that can hold paradox without breaking, uncertainty without panic, mystery without the compulsive need to solve. The fool's journey is not a regression but a spiral return to essence. We do not abandon our hard-won knowledge. We hold it more lightly, like a tool rather than an identity. The surgeon can maintain her skill while approaching each operation with the fresh eyes of someone who has never seen the mystery of healing before. The parent can draw on years of experience while meeting each child in each moment as the utterly unique being they are rather than the projection of what a child should be. This is where the archetypal fool reveals his deeper nature, not as the bumbling idiot of shallow interpretation, but as the divine fool of mystical tradition, the holy innocent who sees through the collective agreements that bind the rest of us in webs of mutual pretense. He is the child in the fairy tale who points to the emperor's nakedness, the court jester whose jokes cut straight to the bone of truth, the wise fool who knows that the most profound insights often come wrapped in apparent simplicity. To embrace the fool is to accept the invitation to play, and play is the language of the soul when it is most free. Not the competitive games of winning and losing that the adult world mistakes for play, but the pure play of creation for its own sake, the play of the artist who paints because colors call to her, the play of the musician who follows melodies wherever they lead, the play of the lover who courts mystery rather than seeking to possess it. In this sacred play, failure transforms from enemy to teacher, from shame to sacrament. The fool stumbles not from clumsiness, but from courage, the courage to attempt what he cannot already do, to reach for what lies beyond his grasp, to risk looking ridiculous in service of something larger than his image. Each stumble becomes a dance step, each fall a chance to see the world from a new angle, each recovery a small resurrection that strengthens the muscle of resilience. The rational mind, that faithful guardian of survival and success, initially recoils from the fool's invitation. It has worked so hard to build the walls of competence, to earn the respect that comes with expertise, to create the safety that knowledge provides. But gradually, even the rational mind begins to recognize that its own gifts are enhanced rather than threatened by the fool's perspective. Analysis becomes more creative when seasoned with wonder. Problem-solving becomes more innovative when approached with playful experimentation. Leadership becomes more inspiring when it admits its own learning edge. As we walk the fool's path, we discover that the greatest innovations, the most profound insights, the deepest healing often come not from the fortress of expertise, but from the fertile ground of not knowing. The scientist who revolutionizes her field does so not by applying known formulas, but by asking questions that her training never taught her to ask. The healer who facilitates miraculous transformation does so not by following protocols, but by staying present to what wants to emerge in the unique alchemy of each encounter. The fool teaches us that mastery itself is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the cultivation of presence, the ability to meet each moment with fresh awareness, to respond rather than react, to create rather than merely repeat. True mastery maintains beginner's mind even in the midst of great skill, like the Zen master who bows to his tea as deeply after 40 years of ceremony as he did on his first day of practice. In relationship, the fool's wisdom transforms everything. Instead of meeting our beloved with the accumulated assumptions of all our previous encounters, we allow ourselves to be surprised by who they are today, in this moment, in this conversation. The parent who embraces beginner's mind discovers that each child is a unique universe, requiring not the application of parenting theories, but the willingness to be taught by the specific being before them. The fool's bag is light because he has learned to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely familiar. The essential travels well: compassion, curiosity, courage, the capacity for wonder. The merely familiar, our habitual ways of seeing, our rehearsed responses, our professional personas, can be left behind without loss, for they will be there if we need them, but they need not define the boundaries of our becoming. At the cliff's edge where the fool dances, we discover that the abyss is not empty but pregnant with possibility. What looks like ending is actually beginning. What appears as loss is actually space for something new to be born. The step into not knowing is the step into the creative force that birthed galaxies, the same impulse that turns seeds into forests, the same energy that transforms caterpillars into butterflies through the complete dissolution of everything they thought they were. This is the fool's greatest gift, the recognition that we are not fixed entities moving through a static world, but creative processes in constant dialogue with a creative cosmos. Every moment offers the invitation to begin again, to meet life with the fresh eyes of someone who has never seen it before, to approach our deepest challenges with the innovative spirit of someone who has not yet learned what is supposed to be impossible. The archetypal fool reminds us that wisdom and innocence are not opposites, but dance partners, each enhancing the other in the grand choreography of conscious evolution. The wise fool and the innocent sage are the same, being viewed from different angles. Someone who has learned enough to know how little they know. Someone who has experienced enough to remain astonished by the mystery. As you feel the fool's energy stirring within your own psyche, notice how it wants to express itself. Perhaps it calls you to take that creative class you've been postponing until you feel ready. Perhaps it invites you to approach a difficult conversation without a script, trusting that the right words will emerge from genuine presence. Perhaps it encourages you to play with ideas that feel too wild, too impractical, too unprecedented to be taken seriously by the expert mind. The fool's step is always taken in faith, Not blind faith, but the deep faith that comes from recognizing ourselves as expressions of the same creative intelligence that guides birds in migration and rivers to the sea. This is not the faith that avoids uncertainty, but the faith that dances with it, knowing that the next step will be revealed in the taking of this step, that the path is made by walking, that the dance is learned by dancing. In embracing the archetypal fool, we do not abandon discernment or become naively optimistic about the world's shadows. Instead, we cultivate the ability to hold both wisdom and wonder, both experience and innocence, both skill and spontaneity in the same moment of awareness. We become fools in the deepest sense, those who follow the call of authentic becoming rather than the safer path of social expectation. Those who trust the intelligence of uncertainty more than the comfort of false certainty. The fool's journey never ends because every moment offers a new beginning, every breath a fresh start, every encounter an opportunity to be surprised by life's infinite creativity. As you stand at your own cliff's edge, feeling the familiar ground of old identities shifting beneath your feet, remember that the fool's step is not a fall, but a flight. Not into chaos, but into the creative heart of existence itself, where all true adventures begin with the simple, radical act of saying yes to what you do not yet know how to become. Something ancient stirs in the depths of consciousness, like a river remembering its original course after decades of artificial channeling. The waters of your being begin to move with their own intelligence, no longer obeying the rigid banks of should and must, no longer forcing themselves through the narrow passages of pure will. Listen, can you hear it? The sound of your psyche breathing freely for the first time in years, exhaling the accumulated tension of trying to be other than what you are, inhaling the possibility of becoming what you have always been beneath the layers of effortful becoming. This is the invitation of flow, not the popular understanding of peak performance or optimal productivity, but something far more primordial and sacred. It is the soul's return to its natural rhythm, the recognition that beneath all our striving and strugglings is an intelligence more ancient than thought, more reliable than planning, more creative than our conscious minds ever dared imagine. Like salmon returning to their natal streams, some part of us has always known the way home to this state of effortless being. For so long we have lived as generals commanding armies of resistance. Resistance to what is, resistance to what wants to emerge, resistance to the very energy that seeks to move through us like wind through willows. We have made willpower our God and effort our prayer, believing that anything worth having must be seized through the sheer force of determination. But what if we have been swimming upstream against the current of our own becoming? What if the very force we fight against is the one that longs to carry us home? The ego, that faithful but anxious manager of our surface existence, has spent years constructing elaborate systems of control. It rises each morning with its lists and schedules, its strategies and contingencies, its desperate attempts to micromanage the mystery of being alive. It means well, this part of us. It has kept us safe, helped us navigate the world's expectations, built the structures within which our human lives can function. But in its zealous guardianship, it has forgotten a fundamental truth. We are not separate from the flow of life, but expressions of it. Watch what happens when the manager finally takes a break, when the clenched fist of control slowly opens into the receptive palm of allowing. At first, there may be panic, the ego's terror that without its constant vigilance, everything will collapse into chaos. But gradually, something else begins to reveal itself. An organic intelligence that has been waiting patiently beneath the surface noise of mental management, like a master musician waiting for the amateur's frantic scales to end so the real music can begin. This intelligence speaks in the language of impulse and intuition, synchronicity and serendipity. It moves through the sudden knowing that arrives without explanation, the perfect words that emerge from silence, the right action that presents itself in the moment it is needed. It is the force that guides the artist's brush when she stops trying to paint and allows the painting to paint itself through her. The same intelligence that moves through the dancer when the dance and the dancer become one seamless expression of rhythmic aliveness. The mystics have always known this secret, that the separate self who struggles and strives is itself an illusion, a necessary stage of development, but not the final destination. Beyond the ego's drama of effort and achievement lies what they call surrender, not the defeat of weakness, but the victory of alignment, not the collapse of will, but its fulfillment in service to something larger than itself. In the psychological realm, Jung recognized this as the movement from ego consciousness to self-realization, the gradual recognition that what we took to be the captain of the ship was actually only one crew member, and that the ship itself is guided by a deeper nautical wisdom that reads the stars and currents with an accuracy no amount of conscious navigation could achieve. The ego learns to serve rather than command, to receive guidance rather than impose direction, to dance with the mystery rather than solve it. But how does this transformation actually occur? How do we move from the effortful existence of pushing against life to the fluid existence of moving with it? The shift often begins with exhaustion, the kind of soul-deep weariness that comes from years of trying to force rivers to flow uphill, trying to make ourselves into something we are not, trying to control outcomes that belong to forces far larger than our personal will. In this exhaustion, something beautiful happens. The defenses begin to soften, the armor begins to crack, and through those cracks, the authentic self begins to emerge like a flower through concrete. We discover that we don't have to earn our place in the cosmic dance. We are already dancing, have always been dancing, could never stop dancing even if we tried. The music was there all along. We had simply forgotten how to hear it over the noise of our own mental commentary. The first glimpses of flow often come unbidden, in those moments when we are too tired to maintain our usual vigilance, too absorbed in something meaningful to monitor our performance. The writer loses herself in the story and discovers words appearing on the page as if by magic. The gardener becomes so present to the soil and seeds that hours pass like minutes, and somehow every plant ends up exactly where it belongs. The parent responding to their child's tears finds exactly the right words, emerging from a place deeper than advice or strategy. These moments reveal what we might call the genius of the unconscious, not unconsciousness as absence of awareness, but as awareness that transcends the narrow spotlight of conscious attention. It is the vast intelligence that coordinates the countless processes keeping your body alive while you read these words. The same wisdom that orchestrates the complex dance of ecosystem relationships, the same creative force that turns acorns into oak trees without consulting a single manual. When we learn to trust this intelligence, not blindly but with the discernment that comes from experience, our entire relationship to action transforms. Work becomes play when it aligns with our authentic nature. Problems become puzzles when approached with curious engagement rather than anxious effort. Relationships become dances when we stop trying to choreograph the other person's steps and instead learn to respond fluidly to the rhythm that emerges between us. The flow state is not an escape from responsibility, but a deeper way of being responsible. Responsible not just to our limited understanding of what should happen, but to the larger intelligence that includes and transcends our personal perspective. It is the scientist who follows her curiosity wherever it leads, trusting that genuine inquiry serves truth even when it doesn't serve her career plans. It is the entrepreneur who builds something meaningful rather than merely profitable, trusting that authentic value creation attracts the resources it needs. In this state, the ancient split between being and doing begins to heal. Action becomes a form of meditation, work becomes a form of worship, and effort transforms from the grinding friction of resistance into the smooth power of alignment. We discover that we can be both fully present and actively engaged, both receptive to what is and creative in our response to it. The body knows this wisdom intimately. Watch a master craftsperson at work and see how their movements flow like water finding its course. No wasted motion, no struggling against the material, just the seamless interaction between skilled hands and responsive medium. The same intelligence that guides their fingers can guide every aspect of our lives when we learn to listen below the mental chatter to the deeper rhythms of authentic being. But the invitation to flow requires a fundamental shift in our relationship to time itself. Clock time, the linear progression of minutes and hours that governs most of our lives, gives way to what we might call soul time, the organic rhythm that moves in seasons rather than schedules, in ripening rather than racing. In flow, we discover that presence is not a luxury we can afford only when everything is finished, but the very ground from which effective action naturally emerges. This is perhaps the greatest paradox of the flow state, that by wanting nothing, we become capable of achieving anything. By forcing nothing, we align with forces that can move mountains. By controlling nothing, we discover a kind of effortless effectiveness that our effortful existence never achieved. It is not passivity, but the deepest form of activity, the activity of the river that carves canyons through stone, not by struggling against the rock, but by persistently following its own nature. The ego's deepest fear about flow is that without its management we will become lazy, irresponsible, ineffective. But experience reveals the opposite. When we align with the intelligence of our authentic nature, we become more creative, not less. More responsive to genuine need, not less. More able to serve what matters, not less. The difference is that our actions arise from inspiration rather than desperation, from authentic desire rather than borrowed obligation, from love rather than fear. In relationship, this transformation is particularly profound. Instead of trying to manage other people's experiences, fix their problems, or control their responses to us, we learn to offer our authentic presence and trust that this gift creates its own perfect results. We discover that the most powerful thing we can do for another person is not to solve their life, but to be so fully ourselves that we give them permission to be fully themselves as well. The flow state teaches us that we are not separate agents struggling against a hostile universe, but unique expressions of the universe's own creative intelligence, discovering itself through countless forms. The same force that turns stars in their courses flows through our decisions. The same creativity that births galaxies expresses itself through our innovations. The same love that holds planets in their orbits moves through our relationships when we stop trying to direct its movement. As you begin to recognize the flow state's presence in your own life, notice how it feels different from the effortful existence you may have known. There is a quality of aliveness that needs no caffeine, a creativity that needs no pressure, a love that needs no strategy. Like a river that has remembered its original course, your life begins to move with a power and grace that surprises everyone who knew you in your struggling days. The ancient Taoist sages called this Wu Wei, action through non-action, doing by not doing. But these paradoxical phrases point to something quite practical. The discovery that our most effective actions arise not from the ego's agenda, but from attunement to what the moment requires, not from personal will, but from participation in the larger intelligence that moves through all things. This is the beckoning of flow, not as technique to be mastered, but as birthright to be reclaimed, not as achievement to be earned, but as nature to be remembered. It calls us home to the rhythm we have always been dancing, the song we have always been singing, the river we have always been flowing, even in those long years when we forgot we were water and believed ourselves to be only the stones that water moves around on its way to the sea. In the deepest hours of night, when the rational mind finally releases its vigilant grip on the wheel of consciousness, something else begins to speak. It whispers in the language of symbols and stories, weaving narratives so strange and profound that upon waking, we often dismiss them as mere neural housekeeping, random firings of a brain at rest. But what if these nocturnal visions are not the meaningless static of sleeping consciousness, but messages from the deepest intelligence we carry? What if dreams are letters written by the soul to itself, composed in a script more ancient than words, more precise than logic? The unconscious does not communicate like a professor delivering lectures or a GPS providing directions. It speaks as poets speak, as myths speak, as the body speaks through symptoms and sensations that bypass the mind's rational filters entirely. It is the part of us that knows without knowing how it knows, that sees patterns invisible to analysis, that recognizes truth through resonance rather than reasoning. To trust this oracle requires a fundamental shift in how we understand intelligence itself. From the narrow beam of conscious thought to the vast intelligence that orchestrates dreams, synchronicities, and those sudden moments of knowing that arrive like gifts from an unknown benefactor. Dreams begin to change when we approach them, not as curious entertainments, but as sacred communications. The businessman who has spent decades analyzing market trends suddenly finds himself dreaming of wolves, and in those lupine eyes discovers something about his own predatory instincts that no consultant could have revealed. The mother struggling with her teenage daughter dreams of two rivers meeting, one turbulent, one calm, and wakes with an understanding of how to hold space for her child's emotional storms without trying to dam them or redirect their flow. These dream gifts do not come through interpretation in the classical sense, with its rigid symbol dictionaries and universal meanings. Instead, they emerge through what Jung called amplification, allowing the dream images to resonate in the chambers of personal and collective memory until their meaning blooms like flowers opening to sunlight. The wolf in the businessman's dream is not just any wolf, but this particular wolf with these specific eyes in this unique landscape of his psyche. The dreamer becomes archaeologist of their own depths, excavating meanings that belong to no one else but speak to everyone. But the unconscious oracle does not limit itself to the theater of sleep. Its voice echoes through the waking world in what Jung termed synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to mock the rational mind's insistence on cause and effect. You think of an old friend for the first time in years, and that afternoon they call. You struggle with a creative problem, and the solution appears in a conversation overheard in a coffee shop. You face a difficult decision, and guidance arrives through a book that falls open to exactly the passage you need to read. The skeptical mind, trained in the hard school of scientific materialism, initially resists these connections as mere coincidence, confirmation bias, or wishful thinking. But something deeper recognizes their truth, not as violations of natural law, but as expressions of a more inclusive understanding of how consciousness and world interpenetrate each other. These synchronicities are the breadcrumbs left by the unconscious to guide us through the forest of our becoming, signs that we are walking in alignment with the deeper currents of our authentic path. Learning to trust this guidance requires developing what we might call a different kind of literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language in which the psyche naturally speaks. It is like learning to understand poetry after years of reading only technical manuals, like developing an ear for music after growing up in silence. The rational mind, so skilled at linear reasoning and logical analysis, must learn to think in spirals and paradoxes, to hold multiple meanings simultaneously, to find sense in nonsense and nonsense in what seemed most sensible. The unconscious oracle speaks not only through dreams and synchronicities, but through the body's own wisdom. That sudden tightness in your chest when meeting someone new is not random anxiety, but intelligence disguised as sensation. The inexplicable lightness that fills you in certain places with certain people during certain activities is not mere mood, but navigation system, pointing toward what aligns with your deepest nature. The body remembers what the mind forgets, knows what thoughts cannot grasp, responds to truths too subtle for conscious detection. Intuition, that much misunderstood capacity, reveals itself as another dialect of this same language. It is not irrational but trans-rational, not the opposite of logic but its larger context, not guessing but knowing through channels more direct than deduction. The mother who wakes in the night knowing something is wrong with her child. The investor who pulls out of a deal despite all logical indicators suggesting success. The artist who chooses one color over another because it feels right. All are drawing from wells of information that run deeper than conscious awareness. To trust the unconscious oracle requires courage, for its guidance often contradicts the world's expectations and sometimes our own conscious preferences. It may call us toward paths that look impractical, relationships that seem risky, creative expressions that feel too vulnerable to share. It asks us to follow threads that lead into uncertainty, to act on knowings we cannot explain, to trust processes we cannot control. This is not blind faith, but faith earned through experience, the gradual recognition that this deeper intelligence serves our authentic becoming in ways our conscious mind, with its limited perspective, could never orchestrate. The oracle's voice becomes clearer as we learn to create space for it. Meditation is one such space, not as technique for achieving particular states, but as practice of listening below the mind's constant commentary to the deeper currents of awareness. Walking in nature provides another sanctuary where the psyche can speak without interference from human noise and artificial urgency. Journaling becomes a form of active dialogue with the unconscious, allowing its wisdom to flow through pen onto paper before the critical mind can censor or edit its expression. But perhaps the most profound practice is learning to live in a state of receptive attention, present to what wants to emerge, rather than focused only on what we want to achieve. This requires a fundamental reorientation from seeking to shape life according to our plans, to allowing life to shape us according to its deeper intelligence. We become participants in rather than directors of our own becoming, active partners in a creative process that includes and transcends our personal will. The rational mind need not be abandoned in this process, but rather invited into partnership with the unconscious oracle. Logic and intuition, analysis and symbol, planning and allowing, these apparent opposites reveal themselves as complementary aspects of a more complete intelligence. The successful entrepreneur learns to combine market research with gut feeling, strategic planning with openness to unexpected opportunities. The healer integrates diagnostic skill with intuitive sensing, technical knowledge with empathic resonance. This integration does not happen overnight, but through what Jung called a transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to bridge opposites and create new possibilities from their tension. Dreams may provide the first glimpse of integration. showing us symbolic scenes where conflicting aspects of ourselves collaborate rather than compete. Synchronicities may confirm when we are moving in harmony with both conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. The body may register integration as a sense of rightness, of being in the flow of our own authentic becoming. As we learn to trust the unconscious oracle, we discover that it has been guiding us all along, through every relationship that taught us something essential about love, every career change that seemed chaotic at the time, but proved perfectly timed in retrospect, every crisis that broke us open to new possibilities we could never have consciously planned. What we took to be random events or personal failures reveal themselves as chapters in a larger story that our deeper intelligence has been writing all along. The oracle does not promise an easy path, but a meaningful one. Its guidance may lead through valleys of difficulty, across deserts of uncertainty, into forests of confusion. But it promises that every step serves some larger purpose. Every challenge develops some necessary capacity. Every loss creates space for something more authentic to emerge. The path may be difficult, but it is never arbitrary, mysterious, but never meaningless. Children often have easy access to this oracle wisdom, naturally trusting their dreams, paying attention to signs and omens, speaking with imaginary friends who may not be so imaginary after all. But the world's rational training gradually teaches us to dismiss these experiences as fantasy, to trust only what can be measured and verified, to live entirely in the narrow bandwidth of conscious awareness. Learning to trust the unconscious oracle is, in many ways, a return to this childhood wisdom, but now informed by adult experience, refined by psychological understanding, integrated with rather than opposed to rational intelligence. The great mystics and artists have always been fluent in the oracle's language, their works serving as translations of unconscious wisdom into forms the conscious mind can appreciate. Shakespeare's plays emerge from depths of understanding that no amount of conscious study could have provided. Mozart's music channels harmonies that seem to flow from cosmic sources. The great spiritual texts speak truths that resonate in the soul even when they confound the intellect. They remind us that the deepest wisdom comes not through accumulation of facts, but through alignment with the creative intelligence that moves through all things. In our time of rapid change and increasing complexity, learning to trust the unconscious oracle becomes not luxury, but necessity. The challenges we face, personal and collective, require solutions more creative than our conscious minds can generate alone. They require access to the deeper intelligence that sees patterns across time, recognizes connections across apparent divisions, knows how to heal what seems hopelessly broken. This intelligence speaks to us through dreams and synchronicities, through bodily sensations and intuitive knowings, through the silent wisdom that emerges in stillness and the inspired actions that flow from authentic presence. The invitation is always present to lean forward and listen more carefully, to pay attention to the signs and symbols that surround us, to trust the intelligence that has been guiding our becoming since before we were born. The unconscious oracle does not speak in the demanding voice of external authority, but in the gentle whisper of deepest knowing, offering guidance that honors both our unique path and our connection to the larger web of existence. As you begin to recognize the oracle's voice in your own life, notice how it feels different from both wishful thinking and anxious worry. It carries a quality of calm certainty, of rightness that needs no justification, of knowing that transcends the usual mental processes. It may arrive as sudden clarity about a relationship, unexpected insight about a creative project, or simple knowing about which direction to walk when standing at life's crossroads. Trust these moments. Follow these threads. Allow yourself to be guided by the intelligence that knows your name before you speak it, that sees your destination before you choose it, that loves your becoming even more than you do. In the theater of relationship, we have all been unconscious puppeteers, our fingers threaded with invisible strings that we believed connected us to those we love. Without realizing it, we have spent years writing scripts for the people in our lives, detailed narratives about who they should be, how they should grow, what they should choose to make us feel safe, valued, understood. But there comes a moment in the great awakening of the heart when we begin to see these strings for what they truly are, not bonds of love, but bonds of fear, not connections, but controls, not care, but capture. The marionette strings we have unconsciously attached to our children, our partners, our friends, our parents, these gossamer threads of expectation and projection begin to shimmer in the light of growing awareness, and we realize with something between horror and relief that every tug we have given, every manipulation disguised as guidance, every attempt to shape another person into the form that would complete our own unfinished story has been a betrayal of the very love we thought we were expressing. This recognition arrives not as judgment but as liberation, for both the puppeteer and the marionette. For in the moment we see how we have tried to direct others' lives, we also see how others have tried to direct ours, and the whole intricate web of mutual manipulation that masquerades as a human relationship begins to dissolve in the solvent of true love. True love, it turns out, is not possession but presence, not control but witness, not the desperate attempt to make another person complete us, but the generous capacity to celebrate their completeness as it reveals itself in forms we never could have imagined. The shift from controlling to caring reveals itself first as a kind of grief, the mourning of fantasies we didn't even know we were holding, the parent who realizes she has been trying to live her unlived dreams through her child's achievements, the spouse who discovers he has been attempting to transform his partner into the mother he never had, the friend who sees how she has been using others' approval to validate her own worth. These recognitions come with the particular pain of awakening, the sorrow of seeing how our wounds have wounded others, how our unconsciousness has impinged upon their freedom to become. But beneath this grief lies something unexpected, a tremendous relief. For if we have been unconsciously controlling others, we have also been unconsciously controlled by them, trapped in elaborate dances of mutual manipulation where no one gets to be authentically themselves. The strings that bind the puppet also bind the puppeteer. In releasing others from our stories about who they should be, we simultaneously release ourselves from their stories about who we should be. The process begins with recognition, catching ourselves in the act of writing scripts for other people's lives. It shows up in the disappointment we feel when they make choices we wouldn't make, the anxiety that arises when they express aspects of themselves that don't fit our image of who they are, the subtle ways we withdraw love when they fail to meet expectations we never consciously articulated but somehow believed they should intuitively understand. Watch how the mind works to justify these controls. I'm only trying to help. I know what's best for them. If they would just listen to me, they would be so much happier. I'm protecting them from making mistakes I've already made. These justifications sound so reasonable, so caring, so wise, but underneath them lies the anxiety of the ego that cannot tolerate the fundamental uncertainty of allowing another human being to be fully, authentically, unpredictably themselves. The ego's deepest fear about releasing others is that without our guidance, our influence, our careful management of their choices, they will make terrible mistakes, choose wrongly, suffer unnecessarily. We imagine ourselves as benevolent guardians of their well-being, failing to recognize that our protection often protects us more than it protects them, protects us from having to witness their pain, from confronting our own powerlessness, from accepting that we cannot control the outcomes of love. But here is what reveals itself as the strings begin to dissolve. People are far more resilient, intelligent, and capable than our worried management ever gave them credit for. Children who are trusted to find their own way often discover paths more creative and fulfilling than anything we could have prescribed. Partners who are loved for who they are rather than who we need them to be often blossom in directions that surprise and delight us. Friends who are met with genuine curiosity rather than subtle suggestion often reveal depths and gifts we never imagined they possessed. The practice of releasing others begins with releasing our stories about them, those carefully constructed narratives about their past, present, and future that we have been unconsciously editing and revising to maintain our sense of understanding and control. The story about why they are the way they are, based on our analysis of their childhood, their psychology, their patterns. The story about what they need to heal, grow, change, or become, based on our projection of our own unlived potentials. The story about what would make them happy, successful, fulfilled, based on what would make us happy, successful, fulfilled. These stories, no matter how well-intentioned, are fundamentally acts of violence. The violence of reducing another human being's infinite complexity to the narrow parameters of our own understanding. The violence of treating their mystery as a problem to be solved rather than a miracle to be witnessed. When we hold others in our stories about them, we rob them of the freedom to surprise us, to change in ways we didn't anticipate, to be larger and stranger and more wonderful than our concepts could contain. The alternative is not indifference, but a deeper kind of care. The care that trusts rather than manages, that supports rather than directs, that holds space rather than takes space. This is the love that says, I see you as you are in this moment, and I am curious about who you are becoming. I offer you my presence, my support, my celebration of your authentic self, but I do not offer you my agenda for your life. This shift requires what might be called emotional sovereignty, the recognition that each person is the ultimate authority on their own experience, the final decision maker about their own path, the only one who can know what is truly right for their unique journey. It means accepting that others' choices may not make sense to us, may not align with our values, may not serve what we believe would be their highest good, and that this is not only acceptable, but necessary for their authentic development. The practice becomes particularly challenging with those closest to us. It is one thing to intellectually respect the autonomy of strangers. It is another thing entirely to watch someone we love make choices that we believe will cause them pain. The parent watching their adult child enter a relationship that seems obviously problematic. The friend witnessing someone's career decision that appears self-destructive. The partner observing behaviors that seem to undermine the very happiness they claim to want. In these moments, the temptation to intervene, to share our wisdom, to prevent their mistakes, to rescue them from themselves, can be overwhelming. But true love asks us to hold a different kind of space, the space of trust in their process, even when we cannot understand it. Faith in their capacity to learn from their own experiences, even when those experiences include pain. Confidence in their ability to find their way, even when that way looks nothing like the path we would choose. This does not mean becoming passive or withholding our care. It means learning to distinguish between authentic support and disguised control, between offering our truth when asked and imposing our truth when uninvited, between being available as a resource and positioning ourselves as a necessity. It means developing the wisdom to know when our help helps and when our help hinders, when our advice serves their growth and when it serves our anxiety. The deepest level of this practice involves releasing not only our stories about others, but our attachment to particular outcomes for them. We learn to want their happiness more than we want to be right about what would make them happy. We learn to care more about their authentic self-expression than about whether that expression matches our preferences. We learn to love their becoming more than we love our image of what they should become. This is where the practice reveals its profound spiritual dimension. In releasing others from our stories, we encounter the fundamental mystery of human existence, that we are all ultimately alone in our journey, responsible for our own choices, authors of our own becoming, and yet simultaneously interconnected, interdependent, profoundly affecting and affected by each other's choices. We are both sovereign and relational, independent and interconnected, free and responsible to each other. The paradox resolves not through logic, but through lived experience. We discover that the more we release our grip on others, the deeper our connections become. The more we trust their process, the more trustworthy our guidance becomes when it is genuinely needed. The more we love them for who they are rather than who we think they should be, the more space we create for who they are to reveal itself more fully. Children especially teach us this lesson. Watch what happens when a child is truly seen and celebrated for their unique gifts, rather than pressured to develop in predetermined directions. They often exceed every expectation precisely because they are not confined by expectations. They discover capacities that were invisible when we were focused on the capacities we thought they should develop. They become more themselves, not less. And in becoming more authentically themselves, they contribute something to the world that no one else could contribute. The same principle applies to all relationships. The partner who is loved unconditionally often grows in directions that conditional love could never have fostered. The friend who is supported in their authentic choices often makes choices more beautiful than anything we could have suggested. The family member who is released from our projections often reveals aspects of themselves that our projections had obscured. But perhaps the most profound gift of this practice is what it gives back to us. In releasing others from our stories, we often discover that we have been holding ourselves captive in stories that no longer serve. Stories about who we should be to deserve love, what we need to achieve to have worth, how we must behave to maintain relationships. The strings that bound others to our expectations were also binding us to theirs. In cutting them loose, we cut ourselves loose as well. The practice asks us to become comfortable with not knowing how others' stories will unfold, not knowing whether our non-interference is helping or harming, not knowing whether the love we offer without strings attached will be received, reciprocated, or recognized. It asks us to love with open hands rather than clenched fists, to care without grasping, to remain deeply engaged while holding everything lightly. This is the love that the mystics speak of, the love that seeks nothing for itself, that celebrates the beloved's freedom even when that freedom takes them away from us, that finds its fulfillment not in possession, but in witnessing the miracle of another consciousness, exploring its own unique possibilities. It is the love that parents learn when they watch their children become independent adults, that teachers learn when their students surpass them, that friends learn when they celebrate each other's growth, even when that growth changes the relationship. As the marionette strings dissolve in the solvent of this unconditional love, something beautiful happens. The people in our lives begin to dance their own dances, sing their own songs, paint their own pictures of what it means to be human. And we discover that their authentic expressions are far more interesting, more beautiful, more surprising than anything our management could have produced. We become witnesses to the miracle of human becoming, rather than directors of human performance. In releasing others from our stories, we do not lose relationship, but find it. We do not lose love, but discover what love actually is, beneath the layers of need and fear and unconscious projection. We do not lose influence, but find the kind of influence that matters. The influence of authentic presence, genuine care, and the faith that each person carries within themselves everything they need to become who they were born to be. The greatest gift we can offer another human being is not our guidance for their life, but our genuine presence to their becoming, the kind of presence that says without words, "I trust your process, I celebrate your uniqueness, and I am honored to witness the mystery of who you are." There is a moment in every life when the hands that have clenched so tightly around the reins of existence begin to soften, not in defeat, but in a deeper wisdom, the recognition that life itself wishes to be received as much as it wishes to be lived. We have spent so long in the masculine stance of doing, of making, of forcing our will upon the world, that we have forgotten the feminine art of allowing, of being shaped by what comes to meet us in the sacred darkness of not knowing. Picture, if you will, hands cupped toward heaven in the first moments of rainfall. The sky has been gray for weeks, pregnant with promise, and now at last the drops begin to fall. But notice, the hands do not reach up to grasp the clouds, do not attempt to direct the path of each droplet. They simply open, creating a vessel, a hollow space where the gift of water can gather. This is, receiving in its purest form, active receptivity, engaged emptiness, the courage to become a chalice for what life wishes to pour into us. We live in a culture that has forgotten this ancient art. From our earliest days, we are taught that worth comes through earning, that love must be deserved, that abundance flows only to those who work hard enough to deserve it. The Protestant work ethic runs so deep in our collective psyche that even our rest becomes effortful, our leisure structured and goal-oriented. We have created a world where being is suspect, where the simple act of existing without producing feels like a transgression against some invisible cosmic order, but the soul knows better. Deep in the unconscious, where the ancient patterns still move like underground rivers, there lives a different understanding. There, the Great Mother still holds court, the one who gives freely because giving is her nature, who loves not because we have earned it, but because love is the very substance from which she weaves the world. There, the feminine principle waits patiently for our recognition, for our willingness to step out of the harsh fluorescent light of constant doing and into the gentle twilight of being with what is. This transition is not a giving up, but a giving over. It is the alchemical marriage Jung spoke of, where the anima and animus within us cease their eternal warfare and begin their sacred dance. The masculine principle, that part of us that loves to build and strive and accomplish, does not disappear in this union. Rather, it learns to court its feminine counterpart, to woo the receptive aspect of consciousness with the same passion it once reserved for conquest. Watch how this courtship unfolds within the psyche. The animus, so accustomed to leading, begins to sense something missing in its relentless forward motion. There is a quality of experience it cannot grasp, a depth of feeling it cannot access through will alone. In dreams, perhaps, mysterious feminine figures begin to appear, wise women, goddesses, or simply unknown women who seem to possess a secret the dreamer desperately needs. These are the messengers of the anima, calling the conscious ego toward a different way of being. At first, the masculine aspect of consciousness approaches receiving like just another skill to be mastered. It creates schedules for rest, techniques for meditation, practices for presence. It reads books about surrender and attends workshops on the art of letting go. But gradually, if we are fortunate, the deeper teaching begins to penetrate. Receiving cannot be achieved through effort. It is not a doing but an undoing, not a grasping but a releasing, not a filling but an emptying that allows fullness to enter on its own terms. This is where the real challenge begins. To receive truly, we must be willing to be touched, and to be touched is to be changed. The ego, that magnificent structure we have built to navigate the world, prefers to remain unchanged. It would rather give than receive because giving maintains the illusion of control. When we give, we remain the subject, the active agent, the one who determines the terms of engagement. But when we receive, we become object as well as subject, passive as well as active, vessel as well as content. There is a profound vulnerability in this opening. To receive love, we must risk being loved for who we are rather than for what we do. To receive abundance, we must release our death grip on scarcity, that familiar companion that has whispered its harsh mathematics in our ear for so long. To receive beauty, we must allow ourselves to be transformed by what we witness, to let the sunset or the symphony or the simple grace of a child's laughter rewrite something fundamental in our neural architecture. Jung understood this vulnerability intimately. His own journey into the unconscious required a profound act of receptivity, the willingness to be invaded by images and experiences that came from beyond his conscious control. The Red Book, that magnificent record of his descent into the depths, is a testament to the courage required to receive the messages of the psyche without immediately interpreting them, categorizing them, or reducing them to manageable concepts. In his work with patients, Jung observed again and again how healing occurred not through the analyst's clever interpretations, but through the patient's gradual ability to receive the contents of their own unconscious. The shadow, that repository of all we have deemed unacceptable in ourselves, can only be integrated when we develop the capacity to receive our own darkness without immediately pushing it away or trying to fix it. The anima or animus can only emerge into consciousness when we learn to receive the contrasexual other within ourselves without attempting to dominate or be dominated by it. This receiving is what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. It is the ability to contain paradox without immediately resolving it, to sit in the discomfort of not knowing without rushing toward premature answers. Like a skilled alchemist tending the fire beneath the retort, we learn to maintain the precise temperature that allows transformation to occur in its own time, in its own way. But let us be clear about what this receiving is not. It is not passivity, that deadening of the spirit that accepts whatever comes without discernment or boundary. True receiving is highly active, requiring what Rilke called perhaps the most difficult thing of all, active patience. It demands that we stay present to our experience, that we remain conscious and aware even when consciousness itself becomes uncomfortable. Neither is receiving a spiritual bypassing of the very real challenges of human existence. We do not learn to receive in order to avoid the necessary work of living. The bills still need to be paid. The relationships still require tending. The body still needs care and attention. Rather, we learn to receive so that this work can arise from a different source, can be infused with a different quality of presence and attention. Think of a master gardener tending their plot. They do not abandon their tools or cease their careful cultivation of the soil, but their actions arise from a deep listening to the rhythms of the earth, from a receptivity to the subtle signals that indicate when to plant and when to wait, when to water and when to allow the natural cycle of dormancy. Their doing is informed by their being with, their effort guided by their receptivity to forces larger than their individual will. This is the alchemical art we are learning, how to let our actions be informed by our capacity to receive guidance from sources beyond the calculating mind. These sources are many and varied. Sometimes the guidance comes through the body, through those subtle sensations and inexplicable knowings that arise when we have learned to listen to the wisdom of our cellular intelligence. Sometimes it comes through the emotions, through the complex symphony of feeling tones that color our experience when we stop trying to control our emotional weather and start learning to dance with it. Often the guidance arrives through what Jung called synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that seem to suggest a deeper intelligence at work in the fabric of existence. When we are in a receptive state, we begin to notice these subtle orchestrations of circumstance and inner state, these moments when outer events seem to mirror inner processes with a precision that defies rational explanation. The book that falls open to exactly the page we needed to read. The stranger who offers precisely the words we needed to hear. The delay that prevents us from being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But perhaps the most profound form of guidance comes through what we might call the intelligence of the self, that deeper organizing principle within the psyche that seems to know something the ego does not. This is not the self-aggrandizing ego self that seeks to enhance its image and secure its position, but the capital S self that Jung identified as the archetype of wholeness, the inner wisdom that guides the process of individuation. Learning to receive from this deeper self requires a fundamental reorientation of our relationship to our own experience. Instead of seeing ourselves as the sole authors of our lives, we begin to sense ourselves as co-creators, in partnership with forces that extend far beyond our conscious understanding. We learn, as the mystics have always known, that we are both the sculptor and the clay, both the question and the answer, both the seeker and what is sought. This shift in orientation changes everything about how we approach the challenges and opportunities of existence. When difficulties arise, instead of immediately mobilizing our problem-solving mechanisms, we first pause and listen. What is this situation trying to teach us? What gift might be hidden within this apparent obstacle? How might our very struggle with this challenge be serving our deeper growth and transformation? This does not mean becoming passive in the face of genuine problems that require our action and intervention. Rather, it means allowing our responses to emerge from a deeper place, from that well of inner knowing that has access to information and perspectives unavailable to the calculating mind. It means trusting that if we can remain receptive to the deeper intelligence of the situation, right action will arise naturally, effortlessly, without the strain and struggle that characterizes so much of our culturally conditioned approach to living. The feminine principle teaches us that there is a time for every activity under heaven, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to speak and a time to listen, a time to act and a time to wait. Learning to receive means developing the sensitivity to recognize these natural rhythms, to feel into the organic timing that governs all living systems. Watch how a plant grows. It does not force its buds to open before their time, does not strain to reach the light, but simply orients itself naturally toward the sun and allows the mysterious process of photosynthesis to do its work. The plant receives earth and rain and light, transforms these gifts through its own unique biological alchemy, and offers its flowers or fruit as an expression of this transformation. There is effort involved, the effort of reaching toward light, of sending roots deep into earth, but it is effort aligned with natural intelligence, effort that serves growth rather than opposing it. This is the model we are called to embody, not the effortless ease of the enlightened master who has somehow transcended the need for human engagement, but the graceful effort of the mature organism that has learned to work with, rather than against, the fundamental forces of existence. We learn to receive not so that we can avoid the work of living, but so that our work can become an expression of our deepest nature rather than a betrayal of it. As this art of receiving begins to permeate our daily existence, we notice subtle but profound changes in the quality of our experience. Food tastes different when we receive each bite as a gift, rather than consuming it as fuel for the next activity. Sleep becomes more restoring when we surrender to it completely, rather than lying in bed planning tomorrow's agenda. Conversations take on new depth when we learn to receive the words and presence of others without immediately formulating our response. Even our most intimate relationships are transformed by this shift. When we learn to receive love rather than constantly working to earn it, we discover that we become more capable of offering authentic love in return. The desperate grasping that characterizes so much romantic attachment begins to soften into something more spacious and trusting. We can allow our partners to be themselves rather than demanding they conform to our expectations because we have learned to receive surprise and difference as gifts rather than threats. The parent who has learned to receive discovers that their children are not projects to be managed, but mysterious beings with their own inner guidance. The friend who practices receptivity becomes a sanctuary where others can reveal themselves without fear of judgment or immediate advice. The lover who has developed this art discovers that intimacy is not something to be achieved through technique or effort, but something that emerges naturally when two beings learn to receive each other's presence without condition. This transformation extends even to our relationship with difficult emotions and challenging circumstances. Instead of seeing anger or sadness or fear as problems to be solved, we begin to receive them as messengers, carrying information about our deeper needs and values. Instead of viewing obstacles as evidence of life's fundamental hostility, we start to sense them as invitations to develop capacities we didn't know we possessed. The shadow, those aspects of ourselves we have deemed unacceptable, can only be integrated when we develop the capacity to receive our own darkness with something approaching compassion. This does not mean acting out our shadow impulses or excusing behavior that causes harm. Rather, it means recognizing that the very qualities we most despise in ourselves often contain energies and perspectives we desperately need for our wholeness. The person who has learned to repress their anger may need to receive their capacity for healthy aggression, for setting boundaries and protecting what they value. The one who is identified completely with kindness may need to receive their capacity for discrimination, for saying no to what does not serve their deeper purpose. The perpetual helper may need to receive their own neediness, their capacity to be vulnerable and ask for support. This integration of the shadow through receiving rather than rejecting is one of the most challenging aspects of psychological development. It requires enormous inner strength, not the strength of resistance, but the strength of containment, the ability to hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. Like a master chef who can taste a complex sauce and discern each individual ingredient without being confused by the whole, we learn to receive the multiple voices within our psyche without losing our center. The practice of receiving also transforms our relationship to the future and to uncertainty. Instead of trying to control outcomes through elaborate planning and worry, we begin to trust in our capacity to receive whatever comes and work with it creatively. This is not fatalism or passive resignation, but a profound confidence in our own adaptability and resilience, a recognition that life has been preparing us for whatever we will encounter even when we cannot see the connections clearly. This shift in orientation allows us to engage with the future from a place of curiosity rather than anxiety, expectation rather than demand. We can make plans and set intentions without grasping them so tightly that we cannot adjust when new information emerges. We learn what the Taoists mean when they speak of the strength of water, the power that comes not from rigidity, but from the ability to flow around obstacles while maintaining essential direction. As we near the end of this exploration of receiving, it is important to acknowledge that this is not a destination but a practice, not a state to be achieved, but a capacity to be developed. There will be days when the old patterns of forcing and controlling reassert themselves, when the ego temporarily forgets this deeper wisdom and reverts to its familiar strategies of manipulation and effort. These relapses are not failures but natural parts of the integration process. The spiral path of development means that we encounter the same themes again and again at deeper levels, each return offering new opportunities for refinement and understanding. What matters is not perfection but persistence, not the absence of struggle but the gradual development of a different relationship to struggle itself. The art of receiving is ultimately the art of trust. Trust in the fundamental intelligence that moves through all existence. Trust in our own capacity to dance with whatever arises. Trust that life itself is not our enemy but our partner in the great work of becoming who we truly are. This trust is not naive optimism, but mature recognition that we are part of something infinitely larger and more intelligent than our individual understanding can comprehend. As we cultivate this trust, we discover that receiving is indeed active, requiring its own form of courage. It takes tremendous bravery to open to life's offerings without the protective armor of cynicism or the false security of constant control. It requires the warrior's heart to remain soft in a world that often seems to reward only hardness, to stay receptive in circumstances that seem to demand constant vigilance and defense. But this is the courage that transforms, the bravery that leads not to victory over life, but to intimate partnership with existence itself. In learning to receive, we discover that we are not separate from the forces that shape our experience, but intimate participants in the ongoing creation of reality. We are the hands that cup the rain, but we are also the rain itself, and the sky from which it falls, and the earth that receives it all with infinite patience and generosity. The alchemical marriage between doing and being, between masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, produces not a static harmony but a dynamic dance, a continuous creation of new possibilities for human experience. In this dance, effort and ease become partners rather than adversaries. Control and surrender learn to support rather than oppose each other, and the eternal paradox of human existence, that we are both utterly responsible for our lives and completely at the mercy of forces beyond our control, transforms from a problem to be solved into a mystery to be lived. This is the gift that receiving offers, the recognition that life is not a test to be passed, or a problem to be solved, but an invitation to be accepted, a dance to be danced, a mystery to be lived with the fullness of our being. In accepting this invitation, we discover that we have always been exactly where we need to be, exactly who we need to be, ready to receive whatever gifts life wishes to offer, through the miracle of our conscious participation in existence itself. There comes a moment in the deepening journey of consciousness when the very nature of action begins to transform. Like a river that has found its true course after wandering through countless meadows and valleys, our efforts begin to align with currents far deeper than personal will. This is the mystery the ancient Taoists called Wu Wei, action that arises not from the frantic calculations of the anxious mind, but from the profound stillness at the center of being itself. We have spent so long believing that strain equals strength, that forcing equals power, that the white-knuckled grip of determination represents the highest expression of human will. But there exists another kind of strength altogether, one that emerges not from muscling our way through existence, but from learning to move with the grain of reality, rather than against it. This is not the weakness of resignation, but the power of alignment. Not the collapse of will, but its transformation into something far more subtle and infinitely more effective. Picture, if you will, the master archer drawing back the bowstring. There is tremendous power in that moment of tension, but watch carefully. The release is not forced. The arrow flies true not because of effort, but because of the precise absence of effort at the crucial moment. All the training, all the preparation, all the conscious cultivation of skill culminates in an instant of complete letting go. The archer becomes transparent to the act of archery itself, and in that transparency, something greater than personal will moves through the gesture. This is the paradox we are called to inhabit. That true power emerges not from the inflation of the ego's capacities, but from its willing submission to forces that flow through it rather than from it. Jung understood this mystery intimately when he spoke of the transcendent function, that bridge between conscious and unconscious that allows new possibilities to emerge from their creative tension. When we stop trying to force solutions from the limited perspective of rational thought alone and learn to wait in the fertile darkness of not knowing, something unprecedented can be born. But how does one learn this art of effortless effort? How does the driven personality, so accustomed to pushing against resistance, discover the grace of moving with the current rather than swimming upstream? The transformation begins, paradoxically, with the recognition of our own exhaustion. There comes a moment when the old strategies simply stop working, when the familiar patterns of forcing and striving reveal themselves as not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. This is what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of any psychological attitude, when carried to its extreme, to transform into its opposite. The person who has built their identity around relentless effort eventually encounters circumstances where effort itself becomes the obstacle. The perfectionist discovers that their very striving for flawlessness creates the conditions for failure. The controller realizes that their attempts to manage every variable actually increase chaos and unpredictability. This breakdown of familiar strategies is not a failure, but a necessary death, the composting of old patterns that must occur before new possibilities can take root. Like the caterpillar dissolving into primordial soup within the chrysalis, our accustomed ways of being must undergo a fundamental dissolution before the butterfly of effortless action can emerge. This process cannot be hurried or controlled. It has its own organic timing, its own mysterious intelligence. During this liminal period, we may find ourselves suspended between two worlds. The old patterns of forcing and striving no longer work, but the new way of being has not yet fully crystallized. This is perhaps the most challenging phase of the transformation, requiring what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt, without irritably reaching after fact and reason. We must learn to trust the process even when we cannot see where it is leading, to have faith in the darkness even when every fiber of our conditioned being cries out for the familiar light of control and certainty. It is here, in this space of unknowing, that we begin to discover what authentic desire feels like as opposed to compulsive striving. Desire, in its pure form, arises not from lack but from fullness, not from the ego's desperate attempt to fill its perceived holes, but from the self's natural movement toward expression and actualization. When we learn to distinguish between these two very different energies, our entire relationship to action begins to shift. Compulsive striving carries within it the bitter taste of should, We should be more successful, should be further along, should have figured this out by now. It is driven by comparison, by the constant measurement of our current reality against some idealized future state. This energy is fundamentally based in scarcity, in the belief that there is not enough time, not enough resources, not enough of whatever we think we need to be truly at peace. Authentic desire, by contrast, carries the quality of inevitability, of naturalness, of something that wants to emerge through us rather than be extracted from us. Like the flower that turns toward the sun, not because it should, but because turning toward light is simply its nature. Authentic desire moves us toward our true fulfillment, not from fear of what might happen if we don't, but from the joy of what wants to unfold if we do. This distinction becomes clearer as we develop what might be called the witness consciousness, that aspect of awareness that can observe our own psychological processes without being completely identified with them. From this witnessing perspective, we begin to notice the different felt sense of various motivations. We can feel the tension and contraction that accompanies ego-driven effort, the way it creates stress in the body and anxiety in the mind. And we can begin to recognize those rarer moments when action arises from a different source altogether, when doing feels more like not doing, when effort becomes effortless. These moments of grace often catch us by surprise. We find ourselves in conversation with another person, and words emerge that we didn't consciously plan, words that seem to carry a wisdom beyond our ordinary understanding. Or we sit down to work on a creative project and discover that our hands seem to know what to do without interference from the thinking mind. Or we face a complex decision and suddenly know, with a clarity that bypasses rational analysis, what path we need to take. In these moments, we taste what the mystics have always pointed toward, the recognition that we are not separate from the intelligence that moves through all existence. We are not isolated agents struggling against a hostile universe, but intimate expressions of the very consciousness that dreams reality into being. From this perspective, effort and effortlessness are not opposites, but different faces of the same fundamental energy. The cultivation of this understanding requires a profound shift in our relationship to time itself. The ego exists primarily in psychological time, always comparing the present moment to some remembered past or projected future, always focused on getting somewhere else, rather than being fully where it is. But effortless action emerges from what Eckhart Tolle calls the power of now, that timeless dimension of experience where past and future collapse into the eternal present. When we are fully present without the overlay of psychological commentary and comparison, our actions naturally align with the needs of the moment. We respond rather than react, creating rather than merely coping. This presence is not a spiritual luxury, but a practical necessity. It is only from this state of alert relaxation that we can perceive the subtle signals that indicate when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push forward and when to step back. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei does not advocate for passivity or inaction. Rather, it points toward a quality of action that is perfectly calibrated to the demands of each unique situation. Like water flowing around rocks in a stream, Wu Wei action finds the path of least resistance, not from laziness, but from intelligence, from an intimate attunement to the natural flow of circumstances. This attunement requires the development of what we might call somatic intelligence, the ability to read the subtle information that the body provides about our environment and our appropriate response to it. The body, unlike the analytical mind, is always in the present moment, always receiving and processing vast amounts of information below the threshold of conscious awareness. When we learn to listen to this bodily wisdom, Our actions begin to carry a precision and appropriateness that no amount of mental strategizing could achieve. But perhaps most importantly, effortless action emerges from the resolution of inner conflict. When different parts of the psyche are pulling in different directions, when the heart wants one thing and the mind insists on another, when conscious intentions battle unconscious resistances, all our efforts become divided against themselves. Like a person trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas pedal and another on the brake, we exhaust ourselves without making real progress. The integration work that Jung considered central to individuation is ultimately about resolving these inner conflicts, not by choosing one side over another, but by finding the deeper truth that encompasses and transcends the apparent opposition. When the various voices within us are aligned in service of our authentic unfolding, tremendous energy is released. Energy that was previously bound up in internal struggle now becomes available for creative expression and purposeful action. This integration is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice, a continuous refinement of our relationship to the various aspects of ourselves. The shadow must be acknowledged and integrated rather than projected or repressed. The anima or animus must be related to consciously rather than lived out unconsciously in our relationships. The persona must be recognized as a useful tool rather than mistaken for our authentic identity. As this inner work deepens, we begin to discover what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to synthesize opposites into something new and previously unimaginable. This is not a mental process that can be forced through willpower, but an organic emergence that occurs when we hold the tension between polarities without prematurely resolving them, like the alchemist patiently tending the fire while waiting for lead to transform into gold. We learn to maintain the precise conditions that allow transformation to unfold in its own time. The experience of effortless action often feels like a kind of collaboration between our conscious intentions and forces that operate beyond the reach of personal will. We set the direction through our deepest values and commitments, but we allow the specific means to emerge organically rather than trying to control every detail of the journey. It is like sailing. We can set the sail and adjust the rudder, but ultimately we must work with the wind rather than against it. This collaborative relationship with existence requires a fundamental trust in the intelligence of life itself. Not the naive trust of the innocent who has never encountered genuine difficulty, but the mature trust of one who has discovered that even our apparent failures and setbacks serve the larger pattern of our unfolding. From this perspective, obstacles are not enemies to be conquered, but teachers offering precisely the lessons we need for our next stage of development. As we cultivate this trust, our relationship to uncertainty begins to transform. Instead of seeing the unknown as a source of anxiety, we begin to recognize it as a field of infinite possibility. Instead of trying to control outcomes, we focus on maintaining our alignment with our deepest truth and trust that this alignment will attract whatever experiences we need for our growth and service. This shift in orientation affects every aspect of our daily experience. Work becomes less about forcing ourselves to be productive and more about creating the conditions where our natural creativity can emerge. Relationships become less about getting our needs met and more about offering ourselves authentically to the dance of intimacy. Even mundane activities like cooking or cleaning begin to carry a different quality when approached from this state of relaxed attention. The person who has learned to act effortlessly does not necessarily accomplish more in the conventional sense, but their actions carry a different weight, a different impact. There is something contagious about presence, something that touches others even when we are not consciously trying to influence or impress them. When we are aligned with our authentic nature, our very being becomes a gift to the world, regardless of what we do or don't do. This is not to romanticize effortlessness or suggest that the mature individual never experiences struggle or difficulty. Rather, it is to point toward a different relationship to challenge itself. When difficulties arise, instead of immediately contracting into resistance or blame, we can maintain our openness to whatever is trying to emerge through the apparent obstacle. We can ask not, "How can I get rid of this problem?" but, "What is this situation trying to teach me? How might this challenge be serving my deeper development?" This shift in questioning often reveals possibilities that were invisible from the perspective of mere problem solving. The loss that seemed purely destructive begins to reveal its creative potential. The failure that appeared to be evidence of personal inadequacy starts to look like a necessary clearing that makes space for something new to be born. The relationship that ended in apparent disaster transforms into one of our greatest teachers about the nature of love and attachment. From the perspective of effortless action, even our mistakes and failures become part of the larger intelligence that is guiding our development. This is not fatalism. We still take responsibility for our choices and their consequences, but we hold this responsibility within a larger context of trust, recognizing that our individual will is part of a vast network of relationships and influences that extends far beyond our conscious understanding. This recognition leads to what might be called humble confidence, the paradoxical state of being simultaneously powerful and surrendered, capable and receptive, determined and flexible. We act with full commitment while holding our plans and preferences lightly. We engage wholeheartedly with our responsibilities while remaining open to course corrections that come from sources beyond our rational planning. The development of this humble confidence requires patience and practice. Like any new skill, it must be cultivated gradually, through countless small experiments in trusting our intuitive guidance rather than relying solely on analytical thought. We might practice in low-stakes situations first, allowing our body to choose what it wants to eat rather than following a rigid diet, taking a different route home and seeing what we discover, saying yes to invitations that come from authentic interest rather than social obligation. As our confidence in this way of being grows, we can begin to apply it to more significant areas of our lives, our career choices, our living situations, our relationships. We learn to distinguish between the voice of fear, which often masquerades as practical wisdom, and the voice of authentic guidance, which may sometimes ask us to take risks that look foolish from the perspective of conventional safety. This distinction is crucial because effortless action is not reckless action. It emerges from a deep attunement to reality rather than a disconnection from it. The person who has learned Wu Wei is often more practical and effective than those driven by compulsive effort, precisely because their actions arise from a more accurate reading of what each situation actually requires rather than what they think it should require. The fruit of this development is a life that feels increasingly authentic and alive. Instead of dragging ourselves through our days, we find ourselves drawn forward by genuine enthusiasm and curiosity. Instead of feeling like we are fighting against the current of existence, we begin to experience ourselves as part of the flow itself, contributing our unique gifts to the larger symphony of being. This is not an escape from the human condition, but a deepening into it, not a transcendence of effort, but its transformation into something more graceful and sustainable. The mother caring for her newborn, the artist lost in creative flow, the gardener tending their plants, the friend offering presents to someone in pain, all demonstrate this quality of effortless effort, of action that arises from love rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness. As we approach mastery in this art, we discover that the boundary between self and world, between inner and outer begins to dissolve. We are not separate agents acting upon an external reality, but intimate participants in the continuous creation of experience itself. Our actions become offerings, our efforts become prayers, our very existence becomes a form of service to the mystery that is living itself through us. This is the ultimate teaching of effortless action, that we are not problems to be solved, but expressions of an intelligence so vast and subtle that our ordinary minds can barely comprehend it. When we align ourselves with this intelligence, not through spiritual bypassing or passive resignation, but through the active cultivation of presence and trust, our lives become both simpler and more profound, both more effortless and more effective. The journey continues, for there is no final arrival at a state of permanent effortlessness. Rather, there is the endless refinement of our capacity to dance between effort and ease, between engagement and surrender, between individual will and cosmic intelligence. In this dance, we discover that we have always been exactly what we were meant to be, doing exactly what we were meant to do, even when, especially when, we couldn't see the larger pattern of which our small part was an essential component. In the ancient wisdom of the tarot, the hermit stands alone on a mountaintop, holding aloft a lantern that casts its gentle light into the darkness below. He is not lost, he is found. He carries within his weathered hands not the borrowed illumination of another's truth, but the flame of his own deep knowing, carefully tended through years of inner work and solitude. This is the archetype toward which we now turn, the emergence of authentic inner authority, that profound recognition of our own capacity to navigate the territories of existence without constant reference to external validation or approval. The journey to this inner lantern is perhaps the most challenging passage in the landscape of human development. From our earliest moments, we are trained to look outside ourselves for confirmation of our worth, our direction, our very reality. The child learns to read the faces of parents and teachers, searching for signs of approval or disapproval that will guide their next move. The adolescent desperately scans their peer group for clues about what is acceptable, what is cool, what will earn them belonging in the complex social matrix of growing up. Even as adults, most of us remain unconsciously dependent on what Jung called the opinions of others, that invisible jury that seems to sit in permanent session, evaluating our choices, our appearance, our success or failure, according to standards we rarely examine and even more rarely choose consciously. We dress for this jury, speak to this jury, make career decisions and relationship choices, with one eye always turned toward what others might think or say about our lives. But there comes a moment in the deepening journey of consciousness when this external reference system begins to feel increasingly hollow and inadequate. Perhaps it is triggered by a crisis, a divorce, a job loss, an illness that strips away the familiar identities we have constructed, or perhaps it emerges more gradually through the slow recognition that no amount of external validation can fill the fundamental emptiness that gnaws at the center of our being when we are living from someone else's script rather than our own authentic truth. This is what Jung called the midlife crisis, though it may occur at any chronological age. It is the moment when the first half of life, with its focus on building persona, achieving social acceptance, and meeting collective expectations, begins to feel spiritually bankrupt. The successful executive discovers that professional achievement tastes like ashes. The devoted parent realizes that their children's approval cannot substitute for their own self-respect. The people-pleaser finally acknowledges that no amount of service to others can compensate for their fundamental abandonment of themselves. This crisis of external authority is simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it requires us to acknowledge how much of our life has been built on foundations that belong to others. Liberating because it opens the possibility of discovering who we actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and compliance. Like the mythic hero who must leave the familiar village and venture into the dark forest alone, we are called to step away from the warm circle of collective consensus and discover what truths emerge in the solitude of our own deep listening. But this journey into inner authority is not a simple rejection of all external guidance or wisdom. That would be the inflation of the ego, the adolescent rebellion that mistakes contrarianism for authenticity. True inner authority emerges from a more mature process, the careful discrimination between wisdom that serves our genuine development and influence that merely seeks to control or diminish us. It is the capacity to receive input from others while maintaining our own center, to be influenced without being dominated, to remain open to learning while trusting our own deepest knowing. The development of this discrimination requires what might be called the cultivation of the inner witness, that aspect of consciousness that can observe our own reactions and responses with clarity and compassion. From this witnessing perspective, we begin to notice how different voices and influences affect us. We can feel the constriction that occurs when we encounter advice that comes from another's fear or agenda. We can sense the expansion that happens when we receive genuine wisdom that resonates with our own inner truth. This process of developing discernment is like learning to tune a delicate instrument. At first, we may overcorrect, rejecting all external input in our eagerness to establish independence, or swinging back toward excessive compliance when the responsibility of self-determination feels overwhelming. But gradually, with practice and patience, we learn to find the middle way, remaining receptive to the wisdom that surrounds us, while maintaining sovereignty over our own choices and direction. The emergence of inner authority is intimately connected with what Jung called the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming who we truly are rather than who we think we should be or who others expect us to be. This process requires us to differentiate ourselves not only from the collective expectations of our culture, but from the unconscious patterns we have inherited from our family lineage and personal history. Many of us carry within our psyches what might be called internal committees, the voices of parents, teachers, religious authorities, cultural influences that continue to operate within our mental landscape long after we have physically separated from their direct influence. These internal voices are not necessarily malicious, but they often represent solutions and strategies that worked for other people in other circumstances, rather than authentic guidance for our unique path and current situation. The development of inner authority requires us to become conscious of these internal committees and learn to relate to them differently. Instead of being unconsciously dominated by them or reactively rejecting them, we learn to engage them in dialogue. We can thank them for their intended protection or guidance, while making clear that we are now capable of making our own choices. We can extract whatever wisdom they offer, while declining their claim to ultimate authority over our lives. This process often involves what Jung called the conversation with the inner figures. In dreams, active imagination, or simply through careful attention to our internal dialogue, we begin to identify and relate consciously to the various sub-personalities that influence our choices and reactions. There is the inner critic who learned to protect us from failure by setting impossibly high standards. There is the people pleaser who tried to ensure our survival by making us indispensable to others. There is the rebel who sought to protect our authenticity by rejecting all forms of authority. Each of these inner figures developed for good reasons, often as creative adaptations to challenging circumstances in our past. But what served us as children or young adults may no longer serve our current stage of development. The inner authority that emerges through individuation is not the dominance of one voice over the others, but the cultivation of what might be called an inner chairperson, a centered presence that can listen to all voices, appreciate their contributions, and make decisions from a place of integrated wisdom. This inner chairperson is not the ego in its ordinary sense, that defensive structure that seeks to maintain a consistent self-image and protect itself from threat or discomfort. Rather, it is what Jung called the self, with a capital S, the archetype of wholeness that serves as the organizing principle of the entire psychic system. When we learn to access this deeper self, our decisions begin to arise from a place that transcends the narrow concerns of ego protection and social conformity. The wisdom of the self often operates through what we might call the intelligence of the body, those subtle somatic responses that provide information unavailable to the analytical mind. When we are considering a major decision, we can learn to notice how different options affect our energy, our breathing, our overall sense of vitality and aliveness. The choice that expands us, that makes us feel more present and authentic, is often pointing toward alignment with our deeper truth. The option that contracts us, that makes us feel smaller or more anxious, may be reflecting fear-based thinking or external pressure rather than authentic guidance. But developing this somatic intelligence requires patience and practice. In our culture of mental overstimulation and physical disconnection, many of us have lost touch with the subtle signals that the body provides about our environment and our appropriate responses to it. We may need to slow down, to create spaces of quiet and stillness, where these more delicate forms of communication can be heard above the noise of our busy minds. The cultivation of inner authority also requires us to develop comfort with what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. The ego prefers clear answers, definitive guidance, black and white choices that eliminate the discomfort of ambiguity. But authentic inner authority often emerges from our willingness to sit with complexity, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to wait for clarity to emerge organically rather than forcing premature decisions. This tolerance for uncertainty is particularly challenging in a culture that equates not knowing with weakness or failure. We are expected to have opinions about everything, to know what we want and where we are going at all times. But the person who is developing genuine inner authority recognizes that "I don't know" can be a position of great strength and wisdom. It is only from this place of authentic unknowing that new possibilities can emerge, that creative solutions can arise, that we can respond freshly to the unique circumstances of our current situation, rather than recycling old patterns and assumptions. The journey toward inner authority often involves what might be called the dark night of the soul, periods when our familiar sources of guidance and certainty temporarily fail us, leaving us suspended in a space of not knowing that can feel terrifying to the ego mind. These periods are not punishments or signs that we are doing something wrong, but necessary initiations into deeper levels of trust and self-reliance. During these dark nights, we may find that the spiritual practices that once sustained us feel empty or meaningless. The relationships that provided security may feel distant or inadequate. The career that gave us identity may seem hollow or unfulfilling. Even our sense of who we are may feel uncertain and unstable. This dissolution of familiar structures is not a breakdown but a breakthrough, the necessary composting of old patterns that must occur before new growth can emerge. The temptation during these periods is to grasp for external reassurance, to seek someone else who will tell us what to do, where to go, how to proceed. But the deeper invitation is to learn to trust the darkness itself, to discover that we can survive and even thrive in the absence of external guidance. Like seeds that germinate in the dark earth, our authentic authority often emerges from these periods of apparent emptiness and confusion. This process requires tremendous courage, not the courage of action, but the courage of patience, not the bravery of knowing, but the bravery of not knowing. We must learn to trust that we have within us everything we need to navigate whatever circumstances arise, even when we cannot see the path clearly. This trust is not naive optimism, but mature recognition that we are part of the same intelligence that moves the stars and seasons, that governs the growth of plants and the migration of birds. As inner authority begins to establish itself, we notice profound changes in how we relate to the opinions and expectations of others. We can receive feedback and advice without automatically accepting or rejecting it. We can appreciate the concern of family and friends without feeling obligated to follow their suggestions. We can acknowledge the wisdom of teachers and mentors while maintaining our own power to choose what serves our path and what does not. This shift often creates temporary turbulence in our relationships, particularly with those who have been accustomed to influencing or directing our choices. Parents may feel rejected when we no longer automatically defer to their preferences. Friends may feel abandoned when we choose authenticity over social conformity. Colleagues may feel threatened when we stop seeking their approval or validation for every decision. But these disruptions, while temporarily painful, often lead to more authentic and satisfying relationships in the long run. When we stop looking to others to complete us or validate us, we can relate to them from fullness rather than neediness. We can offer genuine presence and support because we are not constantly focused on what we might get in return. We can love more freely because we are not desperately trying to earn love through performance or compliance. The person who has developed genuine inner authority does not become isolated or arrogant. On the contrary, they often become more available for authentic intimacy because they are no longer defended against their own truth or constantly calculating how to present themselves in the most favorable light. They can be vulnerable because they are not dependent on others' reactions for their sense of self-worth. They can be honest because they are not afraid of disapproval or rejection. This authenticity has a quality that touches others deeply, especially when it challenges their own patterns of people-pleasing or social conformity. There is something contagious about the presence of someone who has learned to trust their own inner guidance, something that gives others permission to begin their own journey toward authenticity and self-trust. But developing inner authority is not a one-time achievement. It is an ongoing practice that requires constant refinement and renewal. The inner compass that guides us is sensitive to many influences: our physical health, our emotional state, the quality of our relationships, the degree of stress or peace in our environment. Learning to maintain our center while navigating these various influences is itself a lifelong art. Sometimes we will make decisions that seem wise in the moment, but prove to be mistakes in retrospect. This is not evidence that our inner authority is flawed, but simply part of the learning process. Unlike external authorities who claim infallibility, our inner guidance is humble enough to course correct when new information becomes available. We can acknowledge our errors without losing faith in our capacity to navigate future choices more skillfully. The mature expression of inner authority includes the recognition that we are not isolated decision-makers, but interconnected beings whose choices affect and are affected by countless others. True inner authority is not selfish, but deeply considerate of the web of relationships in which we are embedded. We can honor our own truth while remaining sensitive to the needs and well-being of those around us. We can maintain our center while remaining open to the influence of love, wisdom, and beauty wherever we encounter them. This is the paradox of authentic maturity. The more deeply we trust our own inner guidance, the more capable we become of genuine service to others. The person who has learned to follow their own inner light becomes a beacon for those who are still struggling to find their way in the darkness of external dependence and approval-seeking. The hermit on the mountaintop holds his lantern not only for his own guidance, but as a lighthouse for other travelers on the path. His solitude is not withdrawal from the world, but preparation for deeper engagement with it. His inner authority is not selfishness, but the foundation for authentic generosity and service. As we cultivate this inner authority, we begin to trust what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, those deeper currents of intelligence that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. We learn to pay attention to our dreams, to the synchronicities that seem to comment on our life situations, to the subtle promptings of intuition that often carry more accurate information than our rational analysis. This is not anti-intellectual or opposed to careful thinking, but rather the integration of rational analysis with other forms of knowing. The person who has developed inner authority can think clearly and logically when analytical thinking is called for, but they can also access other forms of intelligence when the situation requires it. They can feel their way into complex interpersonal dynamics, sense the emotional undercurrents in a room, know intuitively when to speak and when to remain silent. The development of these more subtle forms of perception requires what might be called the cultivation of emptiness, the willingness to create space in our lives for listening, for reflection, for the quiet attending that allows deeper truths to emerge. In our culture of constant stimulation and activity, this emptiness often feels uncomfortable or even threatening. We may fear that if we slow down, if we create space for silence and solitude, we will discover that there is nothing inside us, no authentic self to be found. But the opposite proves to be true. It is only when we learn to tolerate and even welcome emptiness that we discover the fullness that has always been present at our core. Like a well that must be allowed to refill after being drawn from, our inner authority requires periods of receptivity and rest in order to maintain its clarity and wisdom.